He pushed the mop cart through the glass doors while armed men were already locking every exit behind him. Nobody looked at him. Nobody needed to know his name. To everyone in that building, he was just the janitor. Invisible, replaceable, easier to ignore than the security cameras they had already disabled one by one. But tonight, being invisible was the only thing that was going to keep anyone alive. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The floor on the 43rd level of Sterling Tower smelled like money and secrets, and Dylan Mercer had learned to tell the difference between the two. Money smelled like the leather chairs that cost more than his monthly rent, like the imported espresso that brewed automatically every morning at 6, like the mahogany conference table that stretched the length of a school bus and never had a single scratch on it, no matter how many high-stakes deals got hammered out across its surface. He knew that smell. He'd cleaned around it 5 nights a week for the past 14 months. Secrets smelled different. Secrets smelled like sweat underneath expensive cologne, like the faint chemical trace of a solvent someone had used to wipe down a surface they weren't supposed to touch, like the specific kind of tension that makes the air in a room feel slightly thicker than it should. Tonight, the 43rd floor smelled like secrets. A lot of them. Dylan noticed it the moment the elevator doors opened at 10:30. He stood there for a second, mop cart in front of him, janitor's uniform pressed clean the way he always kept it, and just breathed. His daughter Lily had pressed her tiny palm against his cheek that morning before school and said, "You always smell like clean, Daddy." He hadn't known what to say to that. He just kissed her forehead and told her to eat her breakfast. He stepped off the elevator. The hallway was quiet, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the emergency exit door at the far end of the corridor. It was propped open exactly 2 inches with what looked like a folded piece of cardboard. Dylan clocked it without stopping, without changing pace, without looking directly at it. He just kept walking, kept his head down, kept his hands on the cart. Old habits. The problem with old habits, he'd learned, was that they never fully died. You could bury them under 14 months of night shifts and grocery runs and reading picture books about talking animals to a 5-year-old who couldn't get enough of them. You could convince yourself that the person who used to scan a room for threats the moment he walked into it was gone, replaced by someone simpler, someone calmer, someone who had no business thinking about sightlines and exit routes and the weight of a man's footstep when he's trying not to be heard. But the habits stayed. They just waited. Dylan parked his cart outside the executive washroom and started with the sinks. The mirror showed a man who looked older than 32. Not because he was worn out exactly, but because his face had that specific quality of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. His jaw was heavy, his eyes were a dark, tired brown, and there was a scar that ran along the left side of his neck that he usually kept covered with his collar. Tonight, it was visible. He hadn't noticed until now. He ran the tap and started wiping down the countertop. In his earpiece, a single wireless bud he wore in his left ear to listen to Lily's audiobooks while he worked, he heard nothing but silence. He'd paused the book about the rabbit who wanted to be an astronaut somewhere around the lobby. He hadn't turned it back on, because something was wrong. He couldn't have explained it to anyone in a way that would have made immediate sense. There was nothing dramatic, no raised voices, no running footsteps, no obvious signs. Just a series of small things that his brain, trained over years he was trying very hard not to think about, had assembled into a pattern without his permission. The propped emergency exit, the security camera in the hallway, which he passed every night, angled at the precise position that covered the elevator bank. Tonight, it was tilted approximately 15 degrees to the right. Not broken, not malfunctioning, redirected. The second camera, mounted above the executive conference room at the end of the south corridor, was dark. Not blinking red like it did when it was recording. Just dark. The faint smell, barely there, almost nothing, of cigarette smoke near the building's HVAC intake vent. The building was non-smoking. The vents were alarmed. Whoever had stood near that intake long enough to leave a smell knew exactly which vents weren't actively monitored. Dylan finished the bathroom. He walked back to his cart, pulled out the floor polisher, and started moving down the hallway with it, which gave him a legitimate reason to move slowly, to look at everything, to be anywhere he wanted to be on the floor without anyone questioning it. He was thinking about the exit markings. That was the thing that had set off the loudest alarm in the back of his skull. On his third pass near the emergency stairwell, he'd noticed something scratched into the doorframe at waist height. Just a small mark. Might have been nothing, might have been a maintenance code. But he recognized it. He recognized it specifically because he'd been the one, years ago, to teach a group of 12 operators how to use exactly that system. A simple notation language for marking ingress and egress points during a building entry operation. Entry point viable. Exit route clear. That was what the mark said, if you knew how to read it. And Dylan Mercer knew how to read it. He kept polishing the floor. His hands were steady. They were always steady. Even when his chest felt like something was pressing against it from the inside, his hand stayed completely, professionally still. Lily had asked him once why his hands never shook when he carved her Halloween pumpkin. He'd told her it was because pumpkins didn't scare him. She'd laughed and asked what did scare him. He'd said spiders, which was a lie, and she'd believed him completely. The truth was that Dylan Mercer was afraid of very specific things. He was afraid of losing Lily. He was afraid of the call that might come one day telling him that the bridge on Route 9, where his wife Elena had been driving 4 years ago, was back in the news for another reason. He was afraid of sleep sometimes, when the dreams came back dark and tactical, and he woke up with his heart rate already elevated before his eyes were fully open. He was not afraid of men with guns. He'd been afraid of them once, appropriately, professionally. But fear of a thing and competence against it were two different calculations, and Dylan had long since done the math. He turned the floor polisher off and stood still in the corridor. Down at the far end, past the executive washrooms and the CFO's glass-walled office, a light was on in the main conference room, the Sterling Industries boardroom, the room that seated 22 people and had a panoramic view of the city that looked, Dylan had always thought, like someone had spread all the money in the world across a dark table and lit it from below. Someone was in there. He checked his watch. 10:47 p.m. He knew Vivian Sterling's schedule better than he knew his own. Not because he followed it, but because her schedule dictated the floor's activity patterns, and floor activity patterns dictated when he could do his job efficiently. She was usually gone by 8. On the night she stayed late, she stayed in her office on the 44th floor above. She did not use the main conference room at 10:47 at night, but someone was in the main conference room at 10:47 at night. He moved, not fast, not urgently, just a man doing his job, cart and all, making his way down the corridor the way he always did. Past the CFO's office, dark, empty. Past the executive washrooms, cleaned, done. Past the smaller meeting rooms with their frosted glass walls, all dark, all closed. He slowed when he got within 30 feet of the conference room. The door was open 4 inches. Through the gap, he could hear voices. She won't sign. She's never going to sign voluntarily, Reeves. You know that. Then we don't give her a choice. The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow. Between now and then is not a lot of time. It doesn't need to be a lot of time. It needs to be enough time. Dylan kept moving, kept his face neutral, pushed the cart past the conference room door without pausing, without slowing, without giving any visual indication that he'd heard a single word. He turned the corner at the end of the corridor and stopped. His back was against the wall. His breathing was slow and deliberate, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, a discipline so deep in his muscle memory that he didn't consciously think about it anymore. He listened. The security team is already in position on 2, 9, and 31. Elevator overrides go active at 0100. What about the janitor rotation? A pause. Building management confirmed the night shift is a single contractor, solo, no guard partner. He clears 43 between 10:30 and midnight, then moves to 44. So we have a window. We have a window. Dylan's jaw tightened. They were talking about him, not by name. They didn't know his name, which was a small mercy and a useful advantage. But they'd done enough reconnaissance to know his schedule, his route, his pattern. Whoever these men were, they weren't improvising. They'd been planning this for a while. He thought about Lily. Briefly, specifically, the way he always did when his brain tried to remind him that he had something to lose. Then he thought about the woman on the 44th floor who didn't know that the people she trusted were trying to take everything from her. And then he stopped thinking about anything except the problem in front of him. Vivian Sterling had been at her desk since 6 that morning, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that, for the first time in recent memory, she wasn't sure what she was looking at. The document on her screen wasn't supposed to exist. She'd found it by accident, the way you find most things that change everything. She'd been looking for something else, a quarterly licensing agreement that her assistant had misfiled in the shared drive, and in the wrong folder she'd found a file named with a date 6 weeks ago and a string of numbers that didn't correspond to any project code she recognized. She'd opened it because she opened everything. That was the thing about Vivian Sterling that her competitors consistently underestimated. They saw the 30-year-old CEO of a $6 billion biotechnology company, and they assumed that someone that young in that position must have gotten there through luck or inheritance or the right connections. What they didn't understand, and what Vivian never bothered to explain, was that she had built this company from a converted garage in her sister's neighborhood with $30,000 she'd saved working double shifts as a research technician, and that she knew every single number in every single file in every single database her company operated because she had built them personally. She'd opened the file. It took her approximately 4 minutes to understand what she was reading, and then she'd sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers against her lips and stared at the ceiling and counted backward from 20 in her head. What she was reading was a secondary technology transfer agreement, detailed, professionally drafted, bearing what appeared to be 2 of her executive signatures. It outlined the transfer of Sterling Industries' core genomic sequencing patents to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands 6 weeks ago. The signatures were forged. She was certain of that without needing to verify it, because one of the signatures was her own, and she had never signed this document. But the other signature was Marcus Reeves, her CFO, her most trusted executive, the man who had been with her since year 3, who had helped her close their Series B funding, who had given a toast at her company's 5-year anniversary dinner and said that Vivian Sterling was the most honest person he'd ever worked for. The most honest person he'd ever worked for. She'd pushed back from her desk and stood up and walked to her window and looked at the city below. On nights like this, the skyline felt like something that owed her answers. She'd stared at it and thought carefully about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she needed to know before morning. What she knew. Her patents had been transferred without her knowledge or consent. What she didn't know. How many other people were involved. What the timeline was. And whether the people who had done this were finished or whether there was more coming. What she needed to know before morning. Everything. She'd reached for her phone to call the company's general counsel. Then she'd stopped. If Reeves was involved, she didn't know who else was. The general counsel had been appointed with Reeves's recommendation. The head of security had been Reeves's hire. Her assistant had been Reeves's suggestion. She'd trusted his judgment so completely that she hadn't fully realized until this moment how many of the people around her had filtered through him first. She put her phone down. She sat back at her desk and started going deeper into the files. 3 hours later, when the clock on her wall read 10:53, she had a clearer picture. And the picture was bad. 7 executives, 8 months of preparation, a coordinated plan to strip the company's most valuable intellectual property and force a restructuring that would give control of Sterling Industries to a private equity consortium that Reeves had, apparently, been in quiet business with for over a year. She pulled up the board meeting agenda for tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Agenda Item 1, Emergency Restructuring Proposal. They'd scheduled the vote for the morning after they planned to have already won. Her hands were shaking slightly, which made her angry at herself. She pressed them flat against the desk and breathed through her nose and told herself firmly that she was Vivian Sterling and she had been in impossible situations before and she had always found the move. There was always a move. She just needed to find it. She was reaching for her laptop to start pulling the files she'd need when she heard something in the hallway outside her office. A sound that shouldn't have been there. Not footsteps exactly, more like the specific kind of silence that follows footsteps. That deliberate quiet that means someone is trying not to make noise. She stood up, and then the lights on the 44th floor went out. Dylan heard the power cut from the stairwell, the hum of the building, that constant, almost subliminal electrical frequency that a place like Sterling Tower maintained 24 hours a day, dropped in pitch for exactly half a second, and then the emergency lighting kicked on, low and amber, casting the corridor in the color of old photographs. He was already in the stairwell between 43 and 44. He'd been moving for 12 minutes since the moment he'd heard the conversation through the conference room door, and he'd been moving with purpose. In those 12 minutes, he'd done 4 things. He'd called 911 from the building's internal phone on the 43rd floor copy room. He'd given the address, said there were armed individuals in the building, and when the dispatcher had asked his name, he'd said Dylan Mercer, contract maintenance, 43rd floor, and then he'd hung up because he didn't have time to stay on the line and he didn't trust that the phone wasn't somehow monitored. He'd sent a single text to a number he hadn't dialed in 16 months. The text said, Sterling Tower, 43rd floor, tonight. Might need you. He didn't know if the person on the other end would read it in time to matter. But he sent it anyway. He'd gone back to his cart and removed 3 items, a heavy-duty wrench from his maintenance kit, a coil of nylon utility cord, and a halogen work light with an independent battery pack. These were not weapons, but they were tools, and tools were what you worked with. And he'd made a decision. It wasn't a complicated decision. It didn't require much internal debate. There was a woman on the 44th floor who was in danger. There were armed men in the building who intended to harm her or coerce her. And Dylan Mercer was the only person currently positioned to do anything about it. The math was simple. He'd always been better at simple math than he let on. He moved up the stairs carefully, back pressed to the wall at each landing, moving through the emergency lighting in practiced silence. The stairwells in buildings like this were always his preferred route. Maintenance access, unmonitored, direct. He knew every stairwell in Sterling Tower from the sub-basement to the roof. He knew which doors stuck and which ones were silent, and which ones had the kind of lock that required a card reader versus a physical key. The door to 44 was a card reader door. His maintenance badge had access. He swiped it slowly, heard the click, and eased it open 1 inch. The corridor beyond was amber-lit and empty. He moved through. Vivian's office was at the north end of the 44th floor, the corner office, which was a detail that anyone running a building entry operation would have noted because corner offices had 2 exterior walls and only 1 interior corridor approach, which meant it was effectively a dead end. Easy to trap someone in a corner office. You controlled the single approach point and you controlled the person. Dylan was betting that whoever these men were, they knew that. And he was betting they were already moving toward the north end. He moved toward the south approach, the longer route around the perimeter, which meant he'd be coming at the office from the lateral corridor rather than the main hallway. Less obvious. More time. But potentially enough of both. He was halfway down the lateral corridor when he heard voices ahead. 2 men, moving with professional quiet, but not perfect quiet. Good enough for security work, not quite good enough for someone who'd spent years where the difference between almost quiet and completely quiet was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Dylan stopped, pressed into a doorway, measured the distance, 20 feet, both moving away from him toward the north corner. They hadn't seen him. Their attention was forward. He had a decision to make, and he had about 4 seconds to make it. He could hang back and let them move to the office, follow them, deal with them individually when the situation created an opening. Safer for him, probably. But if Vivian was in that office and these 2 reached her before he had a chance to get positioned, he moved, not running. Nothing as loud as running, something faster than a walk, something that covered ground in silence, the way he'd moved through places much darker and much more dangerous than a corporate corridor lit with amber emergency lighting, and he closed the gap in the time it took for both men to round the final corner toward the office. He heard Vivian's voice before he reached the corner. She was talking, not screaming, not panicking, talking in the measured, controlled tone of a woman who was buying time with words because she'd assessed her situation and decided that talking was her best current option. You want me to come with you? Fine. But I'm not leaving this office until you tell me who you're working for. A man's voice, flat and professional. That's not how this works, Ms. Sterling. Then explain how it works. Because from where I'm standing, you just entered my office after cutting the building's power, and you're pointing a gun at me, and you haven't said a single thing that makes me think cooperating with you is in my interest. Your interest is staying alive. Interesting argument. Walk me through it. Dylan was at the corner. He looked around the edge and saw the layout in a single assessment. The office door was open. Both men were inside. Vivian Sterling was standing behind her desk. Smart, it gave her distance and a barrier. And from the angle he had, one of the men had his back partially turned toward the door. Partially. Dylan looked at the wrench in his hand, looked at the door frame, looked at the angle. He had one shot at this before the situation changed, before the man facing the door registered movement or peripheral motion, before the element of surprise, the only real advantage he had, evaporated. He thought about Lily pressing her palm against his cheek. "You always smell like clean, Daddy." He went through the door. The first man went down before he fully understood what was happening, not because Dylan hit him especially hard, but because the mechanics of close-quarters engagement have very little to do with force and almost everything to do with positioning and timing and where exactly you place leverage against the human body. And Dylan placed it correctly, and the man's legs went out and his head connected with the edge of the desk on the way down, and he was done. The second man was faster. He spun, and he had the gun. And for a half second, Dylan was looking at the barrel and doing the geometry. Distance, angle, the cord in his left hand, the wrench now useless in his right because there was no swing available without stepping into the line of fire. "Don't," the man said. "I'm not doing anything," Dylan said. And then, to Vivian, without taking his eyes off the man with the gun, "Ms. Sterling, I need you to move to your left. Stay low." To her credit, she moved. She didn't ask why. She didn't hesitate. She was already reading the room, already understanding that something had shifted, already calculating her next move. And when Dylan said move left, she moved left, without wasting a single second on confusion. The man's eyes tracked to her for the fraction of a second it took her to move. It was enough. Dylan threw the cord, not at the man, at the gun, the specific motion of looping the cord around the wrist and pulling, the kind of disarm technique that looks impossible until you've practiced it enough 1,000 times to do it without thinking. And the gun skittered sideways, and then there was no gun in the equation. And with no gun in the equation, the variables were just two people in their bodies. And that was a calculation Dylan had stopped finding complicated a long time ago. 30 seconds, maybe less. Both men were on the floor. Dylan was breathing slightly harder than he wanted to be, which annoyed him in a distant, professional way. He was out of practice. He looked up. Vivian Sterling was standing against the far wall with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes moving between the two men on the floor and the man standing in her office in a janitor's uniform who had just, efficiently and without ceremony, removed what she now understood to be a very serious threat. She said, "You're the night janitor." "Yes," Dylan said. "Dylan." She'd seen his name on the maintenance roster, he realized. She'd read his name on a sheet of paper at some point and never put a face to it. And now here was the face. "Yes." "There are more of them, aren't there?" It wasn't a question. She was already past the shock, already thinking forward. He could see it in her face. The quick blinking assessment of someone who was accustomed to processing information fast and making decisions faster. "Yes," he said. "I counted voices in the conference room. At least 2 more down on 43. Possibly more in the building. They've been planning this for a while." She nodded once. "The board meeting, tomorrow at 9. This is about the—" She stopped. "How much do you know?" "I know there are armed men in this building who want you to either sign something or disappear. I know they've disabled cameras and have personnel on multiple floors. I don't know specifics. The specifics are that my CFO has been selling my company's patents to a shell entity and needs me to either agree to a fraudulent restructuring tomorrow morning or not show up at all." She said it very cleanly, very directly, the way someone states a fact they've already made peace with. "I have the evidence on my laptop." Dylan looked at the laptop on her desk, then at the door, then at the stairwell he'd come from. "We need to move," he said, "and we need to take that laptop." "I know we need to take the laptop," she said, slightly sharply, and she was already moving toward the desk. He almost said something. Then he didn't. This wasn't a moment that required him to explain himself, and she didn't seem like someone who needed the explanation. She grabbed the laptop, tucked it under her arm, and looked at him. "The police?" she said. "Called from downstairs. They're coming. But the men in this building have elevator overrides and they've been inside long enough to know the layout. We need to find somewhere to hold until the police arrive. The server room on 38, she said immediately. Single key access, internally bolted, no camera coverage because the equipment interferes with signal. If we can get there, how do you know there's no camera coverage? Because I designed the building's security system, and I made that choice deliberately. She met his eyes for the first time directly. Hers were dark, sharp, and considerably less shaken than he would have expected from someone who'd had a gun pointed at her 60 seconds ago. I have some concerns about my judgment tonight, given who I trusted, but that part I trust. He believed her. The stairwell on the south side goes down to 38 without passing through any central corridors, but it goes past 39 and there's a landing that has a maintenance access hatch that opens into the electrical corridor, she finished. I know. I've read every blueprint of this building. She picked up a heavy stapler from her desk, weighed it in her hand, and set it down. Then she picked up a letter opener, solid metal, about 9 inches, and held on to it. I don't know how to fight, but I'm not going in there empty-handed. Fair enough, Dylan said. They moved into the corridor. Behind them, one of the men on the floor was starting to stir. Dylan checked the security cord he'd used and confirmed it would hold for at least the next 10 minutes. Long enough. They moved through the amber-lit corridor side by side, Dylan slightly ahead, Vivian slightly behind his right shoulder. Not because he'd told her to position herself there, but because she'd intuitively found the safest position relative to his movement without being instructed. He noticed it, filed it away. At the stairwell door, he paused, listened. 2 seconds of assessed silence. He pushed through. The stairwell was empty. They moved down, fast and quiet, 1 level, 2 levels. On the landing between 41 and 40, Dylan held up a fist and she stopped immediately. Below them, footsteps. Moving up. He turned to look at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. He held up 2 fingers. She nodded. She'd heard 2 sets of footsteps too. He pointed up, then made a circular gesture. They needed to go back up and find another route. She shook her head, pointed down, held up her hand, palm flat. Wait. Then she pointed at the wall beside the landing and made a small box shape with her fingers. He understood. The maintenance access hatch she'd mentioned. He found it. A flat panel in the wall, about 2 feet square, painted the same gray as the surrounding concrete. A standard building access hatch, the kind that building management used and most people never noticed. There was a simple latch on the right side, no lock. He opened it quietly. Inside was darkness and the smell of dust and warm electrical components. The electrical corridor, a narrow passage that ran between the stairwell and the interior of the building, designed for maintenance access to conduits and junction boxes. About 2 feet wide, tight, dark, hot. He looked at her. She looked at the hatch without hesitating and said very quietly, "You first." He went through. She followed, pulling the panel closed behind her. In the dark of the electrical corridor, with the sound of 2 men's footsteps passing on the other side of the wall, Dylan crouched and waited and told himself he was not, under any circumstances, going to think about whether Lily had remembered to feed the goldfish before bed. He thought about it anyway. Next to him in the dark, he could hear Vivian Sterling breathing, controlled, measured, not panicking. He didn't know anything about her, really. He'd cleaned her floor for 14 months and knew her schedule and the kind of coffee she drank and the fact that she always stacked her files in a specific left-to-right priority order. He knew she worked too hard and probably didn't sleep enough and had a photo on her desk of herself and a woman who looked enough like her to be a sister. He didn't know she'd built her company from nothing. He didn't know about the garage in her sister's neighborhood or the $30,000 or the double shifts as a research technician. But he was starting to figure out that whoever she was harder to rattle than most people he'd worked alongside. And in his experience, how a person handled the worst 20 minutes of their life told you more about them than anything else. The footsteps on the other side of the wall faded upward. Dylan counted 30 seconds, 60, 90. He said barely above a whisper, "We move." "Yes," she whispered back, "we move." And in the close dark of a building that had been turned against her by people she'd trusted, Vivian Sterling moved. On the 38th floor in the server room with its single bolted door and its cool recycled air and its racks of blinking status lights, Dylan sat against the far wall and watched Vivian Sterling work. She was fast, faster than he'd expected, which he acknowledged was an unfair expectation. He hadn't known anything about her capability except that she ran a $6 billion company, which should have been indicator enough. But there was something about watching someone work under genuine pressure, with armed men somewhere above them and no guarantee that the police would arrive before those men regrouped. That revealed the quality of a person's mind in a way that normal circumstances couldn't. She was pulling files, organizing them, copying them to a secondary drive she'd taken from a drawer in the server room that apparently she'd put there herself, and she was narrating what she was doing in a quiet, steady voice, not for his benefit exactly, but as a form of focus, keeping herself oriented, keeping her thoughts linear. The patent transfers went through a dummy approval protocol. Reeves created a secondary authorization pathway 18 months ago under the guise of streamlining the approval chain. I signed off on the streamlining because I trusted him. A pause. I trusted him because he'd been with me for 7 years and he'd never given me any reason not to. Another pause. That was my mistake. I should have built better verification architecture. You trusted someone who worked for you, Dylan said. That's not a mistake. That's how organizations function. She glanced at him. That sounds like something people say to make you feel better about being wrong. It sounds like that, he agreed. Doesn't mean it isn't also true. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a small adjustment, like a recalibration. She went back to the files. Dylan checked his watch, 11:34. He checked his phone. A text had come through from the number he'd messaged earlier. 3 words. On my way. He felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was tight. Someone's coming, he said. She looked up. Who? Someone I used to work with. She processed that. Who did you used to work with? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the floor, at the faint scuff marks on the tile where equipment carts had been rolled over years of maintenance rotations, and he thought about the most honest way to say a thing he generally didn't say. People who handled situations that didn't have easy solutions, he said, in places where the rules were complicated. She was quiet for a second. You're not just a janitor. I'm a janitor now. But you weren't. He looked up. No, I wasn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to copying the files. She didn't ask anything else. He didn't offer anything else. They stayed in the server room and waited, and outside the building the city moved through its ordinary night, and somewhere across town a 5-year-old girl was asleep in a bed with stars painted on the headboard, not knowing that her father was sitting in a server room on the 38th floor of a building with armed men in it, keeping his hands steady and his mind clear and doing the only thing he'd ever been completely sure he knew how to do. Waiting for the moment when everything would happen at once. It was, he thought, a long way from clean. But then, he'd never really believed the smell of clean was the whole story. The server room hummed around them like something alive. Dylan had been in quieter places with more danger in them, and he'd been in louder places where nothing bad happened at all. And he'd long since stopped using noise as a reliable indicator of threat level. What he used instead was the specific quality of his own attention, a kind of internal frequency that had no good name in civilian language, but that every operator he'd ever worked with understood immediately. When the frequency was low, things were manageable. When it climbed, something was coming. Right now it was climbing. He stood up from the wall and moved to the door of the server room and pressed his ear against the cold metal surface. The door was solid steel, internally bolted the way Vivian had described, with no window and no gap at the bottom wide enough to matter. Whatever was on the other side of it, he was getting impressions rather than information. What he got was this. At some point in the last several minutes, the building had gotten less quiet. Not loud. Not the sound of running feet or shouted commands, or anything that obvious. Just the specific texture of silence changing, the way water changes texture before a storm. A kind of pressurization that you registered in your chest before your ears caught up. They're regrouping, he said. Vivian didn't look up from the laptop. How much longer do you need? He'd asked her that 3 minutes ago, and the answer had been 7 minutes. He was checking the math. 4 minutes, she said, maybe 5. The secondary drive is slower than I'd like. Okay. He moved away from the door and did a circuit of the room that took approximately 8 seconds, which was all the space allowed. Server racks on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, blinking their status lights in the dim. A rolling chair pushed under a small desk with a keyboard and monitor for maintenance access. The hatch they'd come through, now closed. The main door, bolted. 2 ways in. One of which he'd secured. One of which he couldn't secure from inside because the maintenance hatch latched from the other side with a simple mechanism that any adult with a screwdriver and a minute could defeat. He pulled the rolling chair over and wedged it under the hatch's frame. Not a real solution. A deterrent. A few extra seconds of noise and resistance that would give him reaction time if someone came through. Vivian watched him do it without commenting. She was tracking him peripherally while keeping her primary focus on the laptop, which was a skill in itself. The ability to process 2 streams of information simultaneously without letting either one degrade. "Your former commanding officer," she said, not looking up. "The one you texted. How far out are they?" "I don't know. I just know they said they were coming." "That's not a precise ETA." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She absorbed that. "And the police?" "I called 11 minutes ago. Response time to a reported weapons incident in a commercial building at this hour should be 8 to 12 minutes. We're past that window." She looked up then, which means either they've been delayed or there's a reason they haven't reached us yet. He'd been thinking the same thing and not loving the conclusion it led to. The men in this building knew the janitor schedule, knew the camera positions, had elevator overrides ready. That's a lot of insider knowledge. "You're suggesting someone in the building may have intercepted the police response." "I'm suggesting it's possible, not certain." She held his gaze for a moment. He could see her running the probability, the same way she probably ran financial models, quickly, without sentiment, accepting the output even when it was uncomfortable. "Then we plan as if help isn't coming," she said. "That's what I'd recommend, yes." She went back to the laptop. 2 more minutes, she said. And then after a pause, "You have a daughter." He didn't answer immediately. The shift in subject surprised him, which didn't happen often. "You said it when you called the police," she said. "Your name, your job, and that you had a daughter. You volunteered that." "I don't remember saying that." "You did?" She paused. "How old?" 5? She nodded slowly like she was filing the information rather than responding to it emotionally. "What's her name?" "Lily." "Is there someone with her tonight?" "My neighbor, Mrs. Adeyemi. She watches her when I work nights." He paused. "She's good with her. Lily likes her." Vivian nodded again. She seemed to be thinking about something that wasn't the patent files or the transfer drive or the armed men somewhere above them. Then she said, "You left a career in whatever it was you did. For her. Didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I left for a few reasons," he said. "But she was the main one." He was quiet for a second. "Yes." Something in her expression changed, not dramatically. Vivian Sterling wasn't a dramatic person. He was already understanding that. But something shifted. The same small recalibration he'd seen in the office when he'd said that trusting people wasn't inherently a mistake. "The man who designed this conspiracy," she said, going back to the screen, "Marcus Reeves. I hired him when my company was 3 years old. I was 23. He had 15 years of experience on me, and I was terrified of making a mistake. And he walked into the interview and said," she paused, and he could hear something in her voice that wasn't quite bitterness, more like the retrospective assessment of someone cataloging their own errors. He said that what he admired most about Sterling Industries was that it was built on actual science instead of marketing, and that most biotech startups failed because they prioritized the pitch over the product, and that he wanted to be part of something that did it the other way around. She closed her eyes briefly. "I hired him on the spot. I remember thinking that he understood what I was doing better than almost anyone I'd talked to." "Maybe he did," Dylan said. "And then he decided what you were doing was worth more to him than working for you." She opened her eyes. "That's an interesting way to frame it." It's just what it sounds like happened. It sounds like you're not judging me for being wrong about him. I'm not. Most people would. Most people haven't been wrong about someone in a situation where the cost was higher than a bad hire, he said. It changes your perspective on how wrong works. She looked at him with something he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not warmth exactly, but something like recognition. Like she was looking at someone she hadn't expected to find in this room. The laptop made a small sound. She looked down. Done, she said. She pulled the secondary drive and held it up, a small black rectangle no bigger than a thumb. Everything Reeves touched in the last 8 months. Every approval, every signature, every communication log that went through the executive server. It's all here. Good, Dylan said. And then the lights in the server room went out. Not the building's emergency lighting. That had been amber and present. This was different. This was targeted. Someone had cut the power to the server room specifically, which meant someone knew exactly where they were. For 2 full seconds, the room was absolutely dark. Not gray, not shadowed, black. The complete absence of light that urban people almost never actually experienced because there was always a screen somewhere, always a power indicator, always the ambient glow of a city seeping under a door. Then Vivian's laptop screen provided a rectangle of pale blue light, which wasn't much, but it was enough. Dylan was already at the door, not because he'd heard something, because darkness was a move, and moves had responses. And the response to a darkness move was to get to the most defensible position before your opponent had finished executing theirs. He pressed his back to the wall beside the door, not in front of it. The bolts were thrown. The chair was still wedged under the hatch. He calculated, if someone was cutting power to isolate them, they were also staging outside the door or the hatch, or both. The hatch was quieter access. The door made more noise but offered less resistance once the bolt was defeated. He thought about Lily again, just briefly, just the specific image of her sleeping with her arm thrown over the edge of the mattress the way she always did, like she was reaching for something in her sleep. Then he stopped thinking about her, because thinking about her right now was a distraction he couldn't afford. Can you get behind the server racks? He said quietly. Yes, Vivian said. She was already moving. The drive goes in your pocket. Keep it there regardless of what happens. Already done. If someone comes through either entrance and it's not me, I know, she said. I'll deal with it. He believed her. He wasn't sure why exactly, given that she'd told him she didn't know how to fight. But there was a quality to the way she moved in this room, in the dark, under pressure, that suggested she had resources he hadn't fully mapped yet. He heard it first as vibration, a faint mechanical grinding from the direction of the main door, which meant someone was working the bolt mechanism from the outside. Not a key. There was no key access on this door from the exterior. They were using a tool, something that interfaced with the bolt housing, which meant they'd either brought specialized equipment or they'd gotten hold of a building maintenance kit. Dylan picked up the wrench from where he'd set it on the small desk, held it, set it back down. Wrong tool for this situation. Too committed, too loud, too much arc. He needed something that gave him control over the first 2 seconds after the door opened, and a wrench wasn't that. He looked at what was in the room. Server racks, too heavy and bolted down. Rolling chair, wedging the hatch. The keyboard on the desk, irrelevant. The monitor cable, possible heavy-duty shielded cable, about 4 feet of it bundled at the back of the desk. He unplugged the monitor and coiled the cable in his left hand. Better. The grinding at the door stopped. A long pause. Then, quietly, professionally, 3 sharp knocks. A pause. 2 more. Dylan exhaled slowly through his nose. He knew that knock pattern. He had taught that knock pattern. In a small concrete briefing room in a facility he was not supposed to name, in front of 11 people who had all since scattered to various corners of their lives, he had described it as the one pattern an adversary was least likely to accidentally replicate because of its irregular rhythm. He threw the bolt. The door opened and a man came through it, moving fast and low, and Dylan stepped back and let him clear the frame before he said anything, because clearing the frame was right, and if you stopped someone from doing it right, you created a problem in the threshold. The man straightened up. He was approximately Dylan's height, broader across the shoulders, with a face that had the particular weathered quality of someone who'd spent a lot of time in outdoor places that were not recreational. He had a short beard going gray at the jaw, and his eyes moved around the room in the quick, cataloging way that never fully left a person once they'd trained it in. "Took me long enough?" the man said. "You made it," Dylan said. "I was in Queens." He said it like that explained everything, which it more or less did. Car was faster than the train. Almost. He looked around the room, saw Vivian emerging from behind the server rack, assessed her in the same quick way he'd assessed the room. "This her?" "Yes," Dylan said. "Vivian Sterling. This is Cal Rutherford." Vivian looked at Cal without extending a hand. Both of hers were occupied, one with the laptop and one hovering near the letter opener she still hadn't put down. "Are you former military as well?" "Former something," Cal said. He had the specific non-answer cadence of someone who'd practiced it for years. "How many are in the building?" Dylan said, "Minimum 6, possibly more. I confirmed 2 in the conference room on 43 and 2 on 44. Building's elevator systems are compromised. Emergency power's been partially cut, and someone targeted this room specifically in the last 3 minutes, which means they know our location." Cal nodded. He was carrying a bag over his shoulder, which he set down on the desk without explanation and opened. Inside were things Dylan didn't examine too closely in front of Vivian, but which changed the shape of the situation considerably. "Police response?" Cal asked. "Uncertain. I called 11 minutes before I texted you. Nothing's come through." "There's a response in progress," Cal said. "I passed 2 units on my way in. They were held up at the block perimeter. Someone called in a secondary incident nearby. Gas leak or something. Classic displacement tactic. They'll clear it eventually, but it's going to be another—" He checked his watch. 20 minutes before they get inside the building. Vivian said flatly, "Someone manufactured a delay." "Looks like it," Cal said, "which means someone in this operation has enough reach to influence an emergency services response." "Or pay someone who does," Dylan said. She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened and then released, a controlled expression of the anger she was clearly not allowing herself to fully have right now because it wasn't useful. Reeves has been building this for 8 months. He had time to put pieces in place I don't even know about yet. "The pieces don't matter right now," Dylan said. "Getting out of this building with that drive matters." She looked at him. "I need to make it to the board meeting tomorrow morning, not just survive tonight. If I'm not in that room at 9 a.m. with this evidence, they table it, they proceed with the emergency restructuring vote, and by the time any legal challenge works through the courts, the patents are so deeply embedded in Cayman shell structures that recovery becomes a years-long fight that costs more than the patents are worth." Cal and Dylan exchanged a look. The look communicated several things without words, the primary one being, "She's right, and this complicates the problem." "Then we need a route out," Cal said. "What's the building layout below this floor?" Dylan said, 37 is mixed use. A commercial tenant occupies most of it, private medical practice. 36 is parking structure transition level. From 36 you can access the parking garage directly, which has its own exit to street level on the north side. Is the parking garage elevator compromised? The main elevators are. There's a service elevator on the east side of the garage that runs on an independent circuit. It's used for delivery access. I don't know if they've gotten to it. "They've gotten to a lot," Cal said, which wasn't pessimistic, just accurate. He was the kind of man who gathered information without adding emotion to it, and Dylan had always found that quality, which some people found cold, deeply reassuring in practice. Vivian said, "There's a second option. My company leases floor space in the building below this one, a separate tower accessible via a sky bridge on the 22nd floor. If we can get to 22 stories down," Cal said, "through a building with 6 or more armed individuals who know your location." 21 stories, she corrected. "We're on 38. That's a significant descent. I didn't say it was a good option. I said it was an option." Dylan looked at the floor, then at Cal, then at Vivian. "There's a third option," he said. They both looked at him. "We don't go down. We go up." Cal's eyebrows lifted slightly. This was, on his face, the equivalent of a full expression of surprise from most people. Dylan said, "They're staged below us and above us. If they knew we were on 38, they've covered the routes down. Going down means moving through them. Going up puts us behind their formation." "Up leads to the roof," Vivian said. "Up leads to 43, where two of them came from the conference room. If they've moved to respawn down here, that floor might be cleaner than what's below us." "Might be," Cal said. "Might be," Dylan agreed. Cal thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "Okay, but if we hit resistance before 40, we pivot back to the south stairwell and take the medical floor." "Agreed," Vivian said. "You two have worked together before." "A few times," Cal said. "How many is a few?" Cal looked at Dylan. Dylan didn't answer. "Fair enough," Vivian said, and she picked up her laptop bag, settled it across her shoulder, and said, "Whenever you're ready." They moved into the corridor. 38 was darker than 37 had been when Dylan passed through it earlier, but there was still enough ambient emergency lighting to navigate. The corridor was empty, which was either good or a staging tactic. Dylan took point, Cal at the rear, Vivian between them, which she didn't comment on but didn't resist. The south stairwell door was 12 feet away and closed. Dylan checked the gap at the bottom. Nothing visible. No shadow shift that would indicate a person standing on the other side. He pushed it open 6 inches and listened. The stairwell above them was quiet. Below, several floors down, he could hear movement, not frantic, but purposeful. People ascending. He looked back at Cal. Cal had heard it too. He held up 3 fingers. 3 people, possibly more, moving upward from somewhere below 35. Dylan calculated. If they took the stairs upward, they'd be climbing toward 43, moving away from the team below. If the 3 below them were part of a pincer, a group above and below intended to converge on 38, then going up disrupted half of the trap, while the other half converged on an empty server room. He went up. The stairwell was a narrow concrete shaft that smelled of dust and the faint chemical trace of the emergency lighting fixtures. They moved quickly, but not recklessly. Speed was important, noise control was more important, and the balance between them was a calculation that Dylan made automatically at each step, adjusting for the slight echo that concrete stairwells produced and the way Vivian's shoes made a marginally harder contact sound than his or Cal's. On the landing between 39 and 40, Dylan stopped them with a hand signal and listened. Nothing above. The movement from below had paused. He didn't know if that was because the team below had reached 38 and found the server room empty, or because they'd held position for tactical reasons, or because something else had changed in the building that he didn't have visibility on. Any of those possibilities was plausible. He chose to move on the assumption that the pause was temporary. 40, 41, 42. On the 42 landing, Cal touched Dylan's shoulder and pointed at the door. Dylan looked. A thin line of light under the door, different from the amber emergency lighting. White light. Either someone had restored power to the 42nd floor, or someone was in there with a tactical light. They went past it. 43. Dylan pressed his back to the wall beside the door and listened for a full 10 seconds. Then he made a small decision. The kind of small decision that mattered more than the big ones, because it was predicated on incomplete information and personal judgment and the specific texture of professional instinct that had no reliable name. He pushed through the door. The 43rd floor was empty, or at least the portion of it visible from the stairwell door was empty, and that portion was the central corridor extending in both directions from the elevator bank. He motioned them through. They moved into the corridor and away from the stairwell, deeper into the floor. Dylan knew this floor better than any other in the building. It was his primary zone, the one he'd cleaned 5 nights a week for 14 months. He knew the layout by feel, knew which rooms locked and which ones didn't, knew where the secondary electrical panel was, and where the maintenance closet on the northeast side had a window that was always slightly warped in its frame from a repair done badly 3 years ago, one that a person could, if they needed to, open from the outside with the right amount of lateral pressure. He knew something else about this floor. Something that had been lodged in the back of his mind since the moment he'd first heard the conversation through the conference room door. The conference room. The one where Reeves and whoever he was talking to had laid out the plan. That room was at the south end of the corridor. Dylan had moved away from it when he'd heard the voices, but there was something about that room he hadn't had time to process properly. The escape markings on the emergency door, entry point viable, exit route clear. They marked points in the building that the operation had pre-cleared for use, which meant that whoever had put those marks there, whoever had done the advance work on this building, had planned the room's geography into their extraction plan, which meant if something went wrong, this floor was also part of their exit strategy, which meant at some point tonight, the people running this operation were going to want to come back to 43. He stopped in the middle of the corridor. Cal almost walked into him. "What?" "The conference room," Dylan said quietly. "South End. That's their rally point. If anything breaks down tonight, including finding us, they come back here." Cal said, "You're sure?" "The entry markings on the exit door. This is their secondary staging floor. They're comfortable up here." Vivian said, "So we're standing in the middle of their planned extraction corridor." "Yes." A pause. Cal said, "Then we don't stay in the middle." The maintenance closet on the northeast side was smaller than Dylan remembered. Or maybe it was that the three of them together made every space feel smaller. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the specific rubbery smell of fresh mop heads, which Dylan had long since stopped noticing on his own, but which was apparently noticeable to other people because both Vivian and Cal reacted to it. They stood in the dark with the door closed but not fully latched. A fully latched door in a maintenance closet locked from the outside, and that was a different kind of trap than the one they were already in. Dylan said very quietly, "Cal, the phone." Cal reached into his bag and produced a satellite-enabled device, not a standard smartphone. He handed it to Dylan. Dylan dialed a number he knew from memory. It rang 4 times. 5. On the 6th ring, a woman answered. Her voice had the specific sound of someone who was already awake but had been waiting rather than sleeping. "Mercer." "Commander Voss," Dylan said. He hadn't called her that in 16 months, and the title felt strange in his mouth, like a word in a language he'd been trying to forget. "I'm at Sterling Tower in Midtown. I need you to make a call." A brief pause. "What kind of call?" "The kind that makes police units currently staged outside a building stop waiting and start moving." Another pause, longer. He could hear her breathing, controlled, professional, exactly as he remembered it. "You're in the building?" "Yes." "With civilians?" "One civilian, the building's CEO. She has evidence of a financial crime that people with weapons are trying to destroy." "How many people with weapons?" "Minimum 6, possibly more. Organized, pre-staged, probably former security contractors given their training level." Silence for 3 seconds. "You should have stayed out of it, Dylan. I know. You're going to tell me there wasn't another option. I'm going to tell you I didn't have time to find one." Another silence. He could hear, on her end, the specific background sounds of someone moving in a space that was not a residential apartment. A controlled, professional environment, the kind of low hum and ambient noise that operational facilities had regardless of the hour. "I'll make the call," she said. 10 minutes. Stay alive until then." "That's the plan," he said. She hung up without another word. He handed the phone back to Cal. Vivian said, "Who was that?" "Someone with the right connections," Dylan said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked like she was going to push it. Then she looked at his face and decided not to. They stood in the maintenance closet and waited, and the building made the small sounds that buildings make at night when the people who fill them have gone. The settling of structure, the whisper of ventilation systems, the distant mechanical pulse of elevator cables in their shafts. And then, from the south end of the corridor, they heard a door open. Footsteps. More than one person. Moving with purpose, moving in the specific pattern of a team that had lost their primary objective and was falling back to a secondary position. They were coming back to 43. Dylan pulled the closet door to, leaving the half-inch gap he needed. 3 men passed in the corridor. He could see them through the gap. Tactical clothing, earpieces, the unhurried movement of professionals who didn't know they were being watched. One of them was talking quietly into a radio. Not in the server room. Either they moved before we cut power, or there's a third party involved. A crackle of response that Dylan couldn't fully make out. Understood. Reeves wants a confirmation on the drive before morning. If Sterling has copies, another crackle, then we need to find her. The three men stopped at the elevator bank. One of them hit the call button. The elevators were still on override, which meant this was someone with access to the override controls, either a code or a device. One of the elevator doors slid open after a brief pause. Two of the men got in. The third stayed. He turned and faced the corridor. Dylan understood immediately. A rear guard. Someone left on the floor to cover the approach while the other two descended. A standard tactic, sensible. The kind of thing you did when you were worried about being followed. The man was approximately 30 feet from the maintenance closet. He was standing still, which was the right posture for a rear guard. Movement created noise and drew the eye. He was scanning slowly, methodically, working through the corridor in sections the way a trained person did. His scan would reach the closet in approximately 45 seconds. Dylan felt, rather than heard, Cal shift slightly behind him. The same assessment, the same calculation, the same conclusion. He put his hand out behind him, palm flat, the signal for hold, and felt Cal's movement stop. Dylan was thinking about the 45 seconds, about what could happen in 45 seconds and what couldn't, about the difference between a situation that resolved cleanly and a situation that created noise, and how much noise the building could absorb before the men in the elevator returned or the ones below came up, or something else changed the equation. He was also thinking about something else, something small and specific and personal. He was thinking about the last time he'd been in a situation like this. Not identical, no situation was ever identical, but structurally similar. A narrow space, a man who didn't know he was there, a decision that had to be made in a fraction of the time a reasonable person would want to make it. That situation had ended badly, not because of what Dylan had done, but because of what happened after, in the chain of events that followed the decision, in the way that clean operations could become complicated ones through no failure of execution, but simply through the terrible unpredictability of other people's choices. Two people had died that he hadn't been able to stop. One of them had been 24 years old and had a brother at home who Dylan had never met and never would. He didn't think about that often. He thought about it now, briefly, and then he set it aside the way he'd learned to set things aside. Not forget them, not pretend they hadn't happened, but place them in a part of his mind that wasn't operating right now, that was quiet and still and could hold what needed to be held without interfering with what needed to be done. The man's scan reached the northeast wall. Dylan moved the door. What happened in the next 20 seconds was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing you described in terms of precision and clean lines. It was the messy, unglamorous physical reality of one person preventing another person from doing something, which involved the specific failure points of the human body that training taught you to find and physics made available, and it was over quickly because quickly was the only way it could be. Any longer and the noise would carry, and noise was the one thing they couldn't afford. The man was on the floor. He was breathing. He wasn't going to be pleasant when he woke up, and he was going to need a medical assessment, but he was breathing. Dylan was breathing slightly harder than before. His left hand hurt in the specific way that close contact physical work produced. Not an injury, just the accumulated friction of force applied. He'd have bruising by morning. He looked up. Cal was in the corridor, having come out behind him. Vivian was in the closet doorway. She was looking at the man on the floor with an expression that was not horror exactly, not the expression of someone who'd never seen violence, but something more considered, like she was cataloging it, like she was updating her understanding of what the night had actually cost. "We need to move," Cal said quietly. "North stairs," Dylan said. "Now." They moved. And somewhere in the city below them, in the carefully managed chaos of a night that was still not finished, police units that had been stalled by a manufactured delay were starting to receive new orders from sources their dispatch coordinator couldn't fully account for, and the block perimeter around Sterling Tower was beginning, slowly and then less slowly, to change shape. Vivian felt her phone vibrate once in her pocket. She pulled it out as they moved and looked at the screen. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Boardroom. 9 a.m. Come. She stopped walking for just a moment, long enough to read it twice, and then she put the phone away and kept moving, because whoever was sending her messages in the middle of the night would have to wait. And Marcus Reeves, who thought he had already won, was going to find out in the morning exactly what kind of mistake he had made. The north stairs were clear. They went up. The north stairwell smelled different from the south one. Dylan noticed it on the first landing. A faint chemical trace layered underneath the concrete dust and the recycled air smell of the emergency ventilation. It wasn't the solvent smell from earlier, wasn't the cigarette residue near the HVAC intake. This was something more industrial. Hydraulic fluid, maybe, or the specific synthetic lubricant used on certain types of mechanical equipment. He filed it and kept moving. 44. 45. The stairwell ended at 46, which was the mechanical floor. HVAC systems, water tanks, the building's primary electrical distribution center. Above that, the roof access door. Dylan had been to the mechanical floor twice in 14 months, both times for maintenance coordination with the building's facilities team. He knew the layout in the broad strokes. A large open space divided by equipment housings, poor lighting, loud, warm, the kind of floor that building management tended to forget about until something broke. He stopped at the 46 landing door and looked back at Cal and Vivian. Cal's face said, "You sure about this?" Dylan's face said, "No." He pushed through the door anyway. The mechanical floor hit them with sound first. The deep, rhythmic thrum of HVAC units running on backup power. The hiss of pressurized water systems. The low-frequency vibration that moved through the floor and into the soles of your feet. It was loud in the specific way that made voices hard to separate from background noise, which was either a problem or an advantage depending on which side of the equation you were on. The space was lit by a combination of red emergency strips along the floor and the pale status lights on the equipment panels. Everything was shadow and red, and the occasional blink of green or amber from a monitoring display. It looked, Dylan thought, like the inside of something that was trying to keep itself alive. "Clear so far," Cal said, just loud enough to carry over the mechanical noise. "So far," Dylan agreed. They moved through the equipment housings, threading between the HVAC units toward the far side of the floor where the electrical distribution panels were. Dylan was navigating from memory, which was imperfect. He'd been here twice, not 20 times, and memory had a way of being more confident than accurate. He second-guessed himself twice in the first 60 seconds and corrected once. Vivian was keeping up. She'd stopped asking questions somewhere around the 43rd floor and shifted into a focused, forward-moving silence that Dylan recognized as the behavioral pattern of someone who'd made a full commitment to the situation and was conserving energy for what came next rather than spending it on commentary. He respected it. They reached the east wall. The roof access door was here, a heavy fire door with a push bar and an alarm strip along the top that under normal circumstances would trigger a building alert when opened. Under current circumstances, with the building's security systems partially compromised, Dylan didn't know what the alarm status was. It might trigger. It might not. It might trigger something that was being monitored by the men downstairs, which would give their position away. He looked at Cal. Cal reached into his bag and produced a small device, a signal emitter, the kind used to temporarily saturate alarm frequencies. He ran it along the alarm strip on the doorframe. 20 seconds of quiet work. "It'll hold for about 4 minutes, Cal said. "After that, the strip resets and anything after is live." "We won't need 4 minutes, Dylan said, and pushed the bar. The roof opened onto them like a different world. The city spread out in every direction, a fact that Dylan registered and immediately stopped looking at because the view was not the point. The point was the roof's layout. HVAC exhausts, antenna mounts, the water tank housing on the north side, the elevator shaft housings in the center, surfaces and shadows and potential positions. The wind was significant at this height, not violent but present and directional, coming from the northwest, which meant it carried sound from that direction and suppressed sound from the southeast. He noted it. Vivian stepped out behind him, and the wind hit her and she pulled her jacket tighter with her free hand and looked around the roof without saying anything. Cal came last and let the door close behind him. So, Cal said, we're on the roof. We're on the roof, Dylan confirmed. And the plan from here is, I'm working on it. Cal nodded. This was apparently an acceptable answer. One of the things Dylan had always valued about Cal was that he understood the difference between a plan that didn't exist and a plan that was still being assembled, and he didn't mistake one for the other. Vivian said, there's a helipad. Dylan looked. She was right. On the south side of the roof, marked with the faded yellow H of a building helipad that looked like it hadn't been actively used in years. The markings were weathered, the surface had small patches of moss along the edges, and there was no helicopter on it. It's decommissioned, Vivian said. The building stopped helicopter access 3 years ago when the liability insurance became prohibitive. She paused. But the landing pad itself is structurally sound. I know because I considered reactivating it last year for executive transport. Did you? Dylan said. I decided against it. Too visible. Too much. She stopped. That's not relevant. No, he agreed. He was looking at the helipad, at the city beyond it, at the lights of the neighboring tower visible across the gap between buildings. He was doing math. The gap between Sterling Tower and the adjacent building to the south was approximately 40 feet at roof level, which was not a gap you jumped unless you were in a movie, and even then you'd need a running start and a reason. That wasn't the math he was doing. He was thinking about time. Commander Voss had said 10 minutes. He'd been on the roof for approximately 2, which meant 8 minutes remained in the window she'd given him, assuming she'd made the call immediately after hanging up, which she would have. Voss didn't delay. It was the quality he'd trusted most about her, and the one that had sometimes made her frightening to work for. 8 minutes. Then police units would move on the building. At that point, the men inside would have a choice: hold position and face law enforcement, or extract. Extraction meant using the exits they'd pre-staged, which meant the emergency stairwells they'd marked, and the elevator overrides they'd set up, and the routes they'd planned for a scenario where the operation needed to be aborted, which meant the roof was potentially part of their extraction architecture. He looked at the elevator shaft housings in the center of the roof. There were 4, one for each elevator bank. 3 of the elevator banks were standard commercial access. The 4th, on the northeast corner, served the building's maintenance and service functions. It was also the elevator bank that had its own independent circuit, the one Dylan had mentioned to Cal earlier, the one he wasn't sure had been compromised. He walked to the northeast shaft housing and examined it. The service elevator didn't exit onto the roof directly. It stopped at the mechanical floor. But the shaft housing had an access panel, a maintenance hatch that allowed cable inspection and emergency manual operation from roof level. He opened it. Inside, through the gap, he could hear the elevator below, moving, going up. Someone was using the service elevator. He closed the hatch and turned around. Cal was already positioned. He'd used the 2 minutes since they'd reached the roof to move to a location behind the north water tank housing, elevated, concealed, sightline across the entire roof. Dylan caught the small movement that indicated Cal's presence and didn't look directly at him, because looking directly at a concealed position was the fastest way to flag it to anyone else watching. Vivian was by the helipad. Dylan crossed to her in 12 steps. Someone's coming up the service elevator, he said quietly. The wind helped cover the words. Her expression didn't change. How many? Can't tell from the shaft sound, at least one. She looked at the helipad, then at the door they'd come from, then at him. She was doing her own version of the same assessment: resources, positions, options. The drive was in her jacket pocket. He could see the slight rectangular shape of it against the fabric. Her laptop bag was over her shoulder, which was an encumbrance if things got physical, which he needed to tell her. If it comes to it, he said, drop the bag. The drive is what matters. The files are on the drive. The laptop also has a secondary. The drive, he said, one hand free. It'll matter. She looked at him for a moment, then unslung the bag and set it against the low parapet wall. She kept the letter opener in her right hand, which he noticed and didn't comment on. The service elevator access door, a separate entrance from the fire door they'd used, set flush with the mechanical floor housing, made a sound. A mechanical clunk of a mechanism engaging. Dylan moved. He crossed to the shadow of the nearest HVAC exhaust housing and pressed into it, which was not comfortable and not particularly well suited to his frame, but gave him a position 6 feet from the access door with the wind at his back and a clear view of anyone coming through. The door opened. 2 men, moving fast, not cautiously, the body language of people executing a plan rather than exploring an unknown space. The first one through was scanning left, and the second was covering right. Professional spacing. They'd done this before. Neither of them looked straight ahead, which meant neither of them saw Dylan until he was already moving. The first man went sideways into the HVAC housing before he could fully process what had hit him. It wasn't a clean technique. Dylan's left foot caught the edge of a rooftop cable conduit, and he lost a half step of balance, which meant the engagement was messier than he would have liked, more muscle and less mechanics, and he felt it in his shoulder afterward in a way that told him he'd compensated badly for the slip. The second man was faster than expected. He'd assessed the situation in the moment his partner went down, which was quick, and he'd made the decision to create distance rather than engage, stepping back toward the access door. He ran into Cal, who had come off the water tank housing in the intervening seconds. What happened between Cal and the second man was brief and conclusive, and Dylan didn't watch it closely because he had his own situation to manage. The first man wasn't done. He was up, and he was angrier than he'd been 30 seconds ago. And anger in a trained person was not the liability, it was in an untrained one. It was fuel, and Dylan had a half step of bad balance working against him. They went to the roof surface together, which was harder than a floor and less forgiving. And Dylan was thinking about leverage and angles and the specific geometry of keeping a larger person from gaining a position advantage when he also registered, in the peripheral part of his awareness that never fully stopped running, a third sound. Not the access door, the fire door, the one they'd come through, behind him. He couldn't look. He was occupied. He heard Vivian's voice, not screaming, speaking, loud and clear, and with the specific controlled aggression of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. "Stop! Right there! I said stop!" And then a male voice, startled, "What the?" And then a sound that Dylan would later describe to Cal as the most authoritative use of a letter opener he'd ever heard in his life, which was not a thing he'd ever expected to have occasion to say. Dylan finished what he was doing on the roof surface, which took another 6 seconds and left him breathing hard with gravel pressed into his left palm, and stood up. The third man, who had come through the fire door, was bent forward at the waist with his hands on his knees and an expression of concentrated pain. And Vivian Sterling was standing 2 feet away from him with the letter opener in her hand and a look on her face that was not triumphant or afraid, but simply resolved. The look of someone who had done a necessary thing and was already thinking about what came next. Cal came up beside Dylan. He looked at Vivian. He looked at the third man. He looked at Dylan. "She hit him with the letter opener," Cal said. "I see that," Dylan said. "In a specific place." "Yes." Cal absorbed this. "Good choice of target," Vivian said without looking at them. "I grew up with 3 older brothers. You learn where to hit people." She took a step back from the third man, who was not recovering quickly. "Is he going to be all right?" "Eventually," Cal said. "Good." She straightened her jacket. "I'm not interested in anyone dying tonight." Dylan looked at her. There was a cut on her forearm, not deep, a scrape from something, probably the parapet wall when she'd maneuvered. She didn't seem to have noticed it, or she'd noticed it and filed it in the same category she filed everything that wasn't immediately actionable. He said, "You all right?" "I'm fine." She looked at the scrape, apparently noticing it now. "It's nothing. We should get off this roof," she said. "That's what we should do." She was right. They had 3 men down, 2 from the access door, 1 from the fire door, and no reliable information on how many were left, where they were positioned, or whether the extraction timeline had changed. The longer they stayed in one place, the more that uncertainty worked against them. Cal had already moved back to the access door and was listening at the shaft. "Elevator's going back down," he said. "Someone called it." "Pulling their people out," Dylan said, "or restaging on a lower floor. If Voss's timeline is right, police entry is in..." Cal checked his watch. 4 minutes, maybe less. Dylan nodded. 4 minutes was not the same as safe. 4 minutes was a window in which things could still go very wrong, and he'd learned not to treat proximity to a window as the same thing as being through it. He looked at the roof. 3 men secured. They'd used the utility cord from his maintenance kit on 2 of them. Cal had his own materials for the 3rd. They'd live. They were going to be uncomfortable, and they were going to have a significant amount to explain to law enforcement, but they'd live. He looked at Vivian. The fire door goes back to the mechanical floor. From there, the south stairs down to 43. Where it started, she said. Where it started. The police will enter from the lobby. We go down to meet them. What about the others, the ones still in the building? Dylan said, if Voss's call worked, the police come in coordinated. They're not going to give the men inside time to regroup. The ones who plan to extract are already extracting. The ones who didn't plan well enough. He shrugged, which was not a dismissive gesture, just an acknowledgement that some things were outside his control. They'll deal with. Vivian nodded slowly. She picked up her laptop bag from where she'd set it against the parapet, checked that the drive was in her pocket, looked at the bag for a moment, then left it there. The files are on the drive, she said, confirming it for herself, not for him. Yes, he said. She left the bag. They went through the fire door. The mechanical floor was louder than it had been, or maybe it only seemed that way now, after the comparative quiet of the roof. They moved through it faster than before, Dylan ahead, Vivian close, Cal covering the rear, the same formation they'd settled into without discussion somewhere around the 38th floor. South stairs, 46, 45, 44. On the 44 landing, Dylan stopped them. Below them, footsteps again, but different from before. Multiple people moving quickly, and underneath the footsteps, a sound he hadn't heard since they'd entered the stairwell the first time. Radio static. The specific bark and hiss of police radio traffic. He exhaled. He hadn't known he was holding something until he let it go. Police, he said. Cal listened for 2 seconds. Yeah, Dylan said. I'm going to call out before we go through that door. I don't want any misunderstandings. Good idea, Cal said, with a flatness that suggested he'd seen what happened when that step got skipped. Dylan opened the stairwell door an inch and called clearly into the corridor below. NYPD, my name is Dylan Mercer. I'm the building maintenance contractor who called in the incident. I'm coming down from 44 with 2 civilians. We're coming down the south stairs. Don't shoot the janitor. A pause. Then a voice, male, professional, with the specific cadence of someone who'd done this before. Mercer, come down slow, hands visible. They came down slow, hands visible. The officer at the base of the 43 stairwell was young. Dylan noticed it and then felt old for noticing it, and he had the tense, adrenaline-managed focus of someone who'd arrived in a situation they'd been briefed on incompletely. Behind him, Dylan could see additional officers moving through the corridor, organized, systematic. You called it in, the officer said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes? How many hostiles? Minimum 6. We've accounted for 5, 3 on the roof, 2 in the building earlier. The 6th I'm not certain of. There may be more I didn't see. The officer relayed this into his radio. Then he looked at Vivian. Ma'am, are you Vivian Sterling? Yes, she said. We've been asked to ensure your safety specifically. If you'll come with Batits. I'll come with officer. She glanced at his badge. Ramirez. But I need someone to confirm the chain of custody on evidence I'm carrying before I go anywhere. The drive in my jacket pocket needs to go directly to a forensic evidence team, not to anyone in this building's security system, and not to anyone whose name I haven't personally verified. Officer Ramirez blinked. Ma'am, I'm not being difficult, she said, with the patient precision of someone who understood that she was about to hand over the most important object she'd ever held and was not going to do it casually. I'm being specific. There's a difference. The people who were trying to hurt me tonight have reach. I don't know how much reach. I need a named detective assigned to this case before that drive leaves my hand. Ramirez looked at Dylan, who said nothing because this was not his call to make, and he had no intention of making it. Ramirez got on his radio. Vivian looked at Dylan while they waited. She looked at his left hand, which he'd been holding slightly away from his body since the roof, because the palm was ground up badly from the rooftop surface, and he'd been avoiding the specific discomfort of bending it. She looked at his face. She looked at the collar of his uniform, where the scar on his neck was visible again. She said quietly, so only he could hear, "You're hurt. It's superficial. Your hand. It'll be fine." She held his gaze for a moment. "Dylan?" "Yeah. Thank you." She said it simply, directly, without the performance of gratitude. No excessive emphasis, no voice catching, nothing that suggested she was trying to demonstrate the feeling rather than communicate it. Just the two words, meant exactly. He said, "You handled yourself. Most people wouldn't have." "I was terrified," she said. "I know." "Is that—" She paused. "Is that something that goes away? The terror?" He thought about it honestly. "It gets quieter. You get better at working around it. It doesn't go away." She nodded, accepting that. "Okay." Ramirez came back. "Detective Karen Osei is being patched through. She's been assigned lead on this case, and she'd like to speak with you directly, Ms. Sterling." Vivian took the offered phone. She walked a few feet away for the call, which left Dylan and Cal standing together in the corridor of the 43rd floor, surrounded by police activity, which was a context that suited them about as well as any. Cal said quietly, "Your hand." "I know." "You slipped on the conduit." "I know." "You're out of practice." "I know, Cal." Dylan looked at him. Cal had the expression of a man who was very carefully not saying several other things. "Say it." "I'm not saying anything." "You have a face." "I always have a face." Dylan leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. "I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice," Cal said. "You chose right, but it was still a choice. I'm not criticizing. I'm noting that you've been telling yourself for 16 months that you were done with this, and tonight was one night. Tonight was also the night the other thing starts back up." Dylan looked at him. "What other thing?" "The thing where you can't convince yourself anymore that you're fully out," Cal said. He wasn't unkind about it. He was just Cal, honest in the specific, unhurried way of someone who'd known Dylan long enough to say hard things without needing to pad them. "You're still you, Dylan. You've always been still you. The cart and the uniform don't change that." Dylan was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, he could see officers entering the conference room where he'd heard the voices that had started all of this. Through the open door, he could see the table, the chairs, the city visible through the window in the amber of the emergency lighting. He thought about Lily. He let himself think about her now, fully, because the situation had changed enough that it wasn't a distraction anymore. He thought about the goldfish she'd named Pancake for reasons that remained unclear. He thought about the morning routine, the specific chaos of it, the cartoon she watched while eating cereal, and the way she always forgot her left shoe until they were almost out the door. He thought about what it meant to go home to that and be the same person who had just been on a roof fighting armed contractors in the dark. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He'd stopped expecting one. "I know who I am," he said finally. "The question is what I do about it." Cal didn't respond to that immediately. He looked at the activity around them. Organized, procedural, the machinery of law enforcement doing what it did. Then he said, "You've got time to figure that out. Tonight's done." Dylan nodded. His hand was starting to hurt in earnest now that the adrenaline was easing off, and he was tired in the specific, deep way that followed this kind of night, the way that sleep didn't always fix. He was hungry. He hadn't eaten since 6 p.m. He wanted coffee. He wanted to go home and check on Lily and sit in the chair by her bed and listen to her breathe. From down the corridor, Vivian returned, handing Ramirez's phone back to him. "Detective Osei is on her way," she said. "She wants the drive held until she arrives personally. Ramirez will maintain custody until then." She looked at Dylan. "She also said someone named Voss called her division commander 45 minutes ago and flagged this building specifically. She wouldn't tell me who Voss is." "Good," Dylan said. Vivian studied him for a moment. "You built a safety net before we even got into the stairwell. The call to the police, the text to Cal, the call to Voss. You were already running contingencies before you came up to my office." "I was running what I could," he said. It was extremely good," she said simply. Not flattery. Assessment. I've built a billion-dollar company, and I've been in rooms with some of the best strategic thinkers in biotech and finance. What you did tonight, in real time, under that kind of pressure, with no support infrastructure and a janitor's cart—" She stopped. "I'm saying it was good. You can receive the information without deflecting." Dylan looked at her. Something about the directness of it, the complete absence of performance in the way she said it, made it harder to dismiss than most things. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said back. Cal, who had watched this exchange, looked at the floor and said nothing. Around them, the building continued its procedural transformation, from the site of a crime in progress to the site of a crime contained, the slow mechanical shift from chaos to documentation, from threat to evidence. Officers moved room to room. Radios crackled. Down at the lobby, Dylan could hear the sounds of additional units arriving. Somewhere in the building, Marcus Reeves's carefully constructed night was falling apart. Dylan didn't know where Reeves was, whether he'd been in the building tonight or directing from somewhere else entirely. That was a question for the detective, for the process that would grind forward from here through lawyers and depositions and courtrooms and all the enormous, unglamorous machinery of accountability. What Dylan knew was simpler. The drive was safe, the woman was safe, the building was secured. He looked at his hand. The palm was going to need some cleaning and probably a bandage, but nothing that required anything more than what he could get from a drugstore. He'd had worse from cooking dinner. He'd sliced his hand open on a can lid 2 months ago, trying to make pasta, and bled all over the kitchen floor, and Lily had said, with complete seriousness, that she thought he needed surgery, and he'd thought it was the funniest thing anyone had ever said to him. He thought about that now, and felt something ease in his chest. Ramirez came back. "Mr. Mercer, we're going to need a full statement. Detective Osei requested that you stay on site." "I know," Dylan said. "I'm staying." And the other, Ramirez glanced at Cal, who had the specific quality of presence that made people slightly reluctant to finish their sentences about him. "My colleague," Dylan said. "He'll stay too." Cal said nothing, which was his version of agreeing. Ramirez nodded and went back to coordinating his officers. The three of them stood in the corridor. The janitor with the torn-up palm, the former operator who'd driven from Queens, the billionaire who'd hit a man with a letter opener on the roof of her own building. And the night around them was loud with radio traffic and footsteps and the specific sounds of a situation being managed. Vivian reached into her pocket and held the drive up between 2 fingers, just for a moment, and looked at it. The shape of 8 months of someone's betrayal. The shape of everything she'd spent 7 years building and what it cost to keep it. She put it back in her pocket. She looked at Dylan and said, "How is your daughter?" The question surprised him. Not the asking of it. She'd demonstrated tonight that she thought about more things simultaneously than most people manage sequentially, but the timing of it, the quietness of it. "She's asleep," he said. "Probably. She usually goes down around 9. What's she like?" He thought about Pancake the goldfish and the left shoe and the astronaut rabbit audiobook and the palm against his cheek. "She talks a lot," he said. "She's got questions about everything. Last week she wanted to know why clouds don't fall down." He paused. "I told her it was because they were too stubborn, and she thought about it and said that made sense." Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh, quick and genuine, without self-consciousness, and it changed her face completely. For a second she looked younger, or maybe just less managed, the version of herself that existed before the decisions and the building and the $6 billion. "That's a good answer," she said. "She's a good kid," Dylan said. "She deserves a good answer." And in the corridor of the 43rd floor, with the city beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east, Dylan Mercer stood and thought about nothing more complicated than going home. Detective Karen Osei arrived at Sterling Tower at 12:47 a.m., which was 11 minutes after she'd been called and 4 minutes faster than Dylan would have expected given the traffic patterns in Midtown at that hour, which told him something about how she operated before he'd exchanged a single word with her. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, wearing a dark coat over what looked like clothes she'd pulled on in a hurry. The coat was buttoned wrong by one button, which she didn't appear to notice or care about. She had a yellow legal pad under one arm and a coffee cup in the other hand that she'd clearly brought from wherever she'd been when the call came in, and she moved through the lobby of Sterling Tower with the specific forward momentum of someone who'd been doing this long enough to skip the part where you assessed the room before entering it. She'd assessed it from outside. She was already working. She found Dylan in the 43rd floor corridor inside of 4 minutes, which meant someone had pointed her in the right direction quickly, or she'd simply gone to the floor that had the most activity and found him there. Either way, she arrived with the legal pad open and a pen already in her hand. "Dylan Mercer," she said. Not a question. She was confirming. "Yes." She looked at his hand. "You need medical." "Later. Sooner is better." She made a note on the pad without writing what she'd said about his hand, which meant the note was about something else she was already thinking about. "You called dispatch at 2247. The incident was already in progress at that time." "Correct." "Tell me what you observed before you made the call." She said it the way people said things they'd said many times, not impatiently, not without attention, but with the fluency of repetition. The question was practiced, but the listening wasn't. He could tell the difference. Dylan told her. He told her in the sequence it had happened, without editorializing, without inserting interpretation where observation was what she needed. The security cameras, the emergency exit marking, the voices in the conference room, the conversation he'd heard about elevator overrides and janitor schedules, and the window they planned to use. He told her about moving to 44, about the 2 men in Vivian's office, about the server room and the maintenance hatch and the stairwell and the roof. She wrote quickly, asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them specific, all of them pointing at details he'd touched on briefly that she'd identified as important, and didn't interrupt otherwise. When he finished, she looked at what she'd written for a moment. "The entry markings on the emergency exit door," she said. "You recognize them?" "Yes." "From where?" "Previous work." She looked up from the pad. She had the kind of eyes that had stopped performing interest a long time ago and just did the thing directly. Previous work was getting a specific look from those eyes. "I'm not going to be able to put previous work in a police report, Mr. Mercer." "I know," he said. "I'll give you what I can give you. Some of it will need to go through a different channel." "Commander Voss's channel." He looked at her. "You spoke with her." "Briefly. Enough to understand that there are parts of your background that are—" She paused, and he got the impression she was choosing a word carefully, "compartmentalized," and that the compartmentalization is legitimate rather than convenient. She made another note. "What I need from you is everything that isn't compartmentalized. The tactical notation system, how you identified it, general terms. It's a marking system used by certain types of operational teams to designate building access points during advanced preparation," he said. "Entry viable, exit clear. Whoever put those marks on that door had done building reconnaissance at some point in the last week. The marks were fresh. The solvent smell around them was still present." "What kind of solvent?" "The kind used to clean metal surfaces before making marks you want to last. Acetone base, probably. It evaporates but leaves a trace for about 72 hours in an enclosed space." She wrote it down. So within 72 hours before last night, someone with knowledge of that marking system was physically inside this building, on this floor, at the emergency exit. "Yes." "Which means they had building access. Or they bypassed security. But given what they knew about the janitor schedule and the camera positions, I'd lean toward access. They had inside information on this building." O.C. nodded slowly. "Marcus Reeves. That would be consistent with what Ms. Sterling found in the files." "Yes." She looked at her notes again. "Reeves is not in the building. We've confirmed that. He wasn't here tonight physically. The operation was run by the contractors he hired, and the communication went through a relay. We're working on tracing it." She looked up. "He doesn't know it's over yet." Dylan processed that. "He thinks the operation succeeded. As of this moment, based on what we know about his communication setup, yes, he hasn't received abort confirmation because the men he sent in didn't send one." She said it with a flatness that was not satisfaction. She wasn't the kind of person who felt satisfied by that kind of irony, but a factual acknowledgement of the situation's current state. "He's probably waiting to hear from them." "How long before he figures it out?" "Hard to say. If he's cautious, he has a check-in protocol. If the check-in fails, he'll know something went wrong. Could be another hour, could be less. She closed the pad. Which is why I need Ms. Sterling in that board meeting at 9 a.m. Dylan looked at her. You want her to go? I want her to go. I want the evidence she has on that drive entered into formal record before that meeting, and I want Reeves sitting in that boardroom not knowing that the entire architecture of what he built is already in the hands of the people who are going to take it apart. She said it simply, as a logistical statement, not a speech. He'll show up because he thinks he's won. When he finds out he hasn't, his reaction will tell us things. People who've planned for a long time and believe they've succeeded, the moment of reversal is revealing. You're using the board meeting as an investigative tool. Among other things, yes. Dylan thought about that. About Vivian in that room, surrounded by people, some of whom had conspired against her, armed with a drive full of evidence and the knowledge of what the night had cost. About Reeves walking in expecting to inherit something and finding out instead what he'd lost. She'll do it, Dylan said. I know she will, Osei said. I talked to her for 6 minutes on the phone, and I already know that. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it, apparently having forgotten she was holding it. It had to be cold by now. She drank it anyway. What I don't know is what you're going to do. He looked at her. What do you mean? You're a material witness to a significant criminal conspiracy. You'll be deposed. You'll likely be called to testify. Some of what you know can be introduced through you, and some of it will need to come through Commander Voss or her channels, and the coordination of that is going to require you to be available and cooperative and willing to put your name on things. I understand that. Does it concern you? He was quiet for a moment. Parts of it? Which parts? My daughter, he said. If my name becomes public in connection with something like this, if it comes out in any context what I used to do and what I'm associated with, I want to know she's protected. Osei nodded. She didn't dismiss it, didn't reassure him with the kind of vague professional comfort that meant nothing. She just nodded, like she was logging a requirement. That's a reasonable concern. I'll bring it to the prosecutor's office when we get there. Protective measures for witnesses and their families are standard in cases involving organized criminal activity. She paused. Which this qualifies as. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. She started to move away, then stopped. One more thing. Yeah. The man on the 43rd floor, the rear guard they left in the corridor. He's got a significant concussion. He's coherent, but his short-term recall is incomplete. She said it with a neutrality that covered something less neutral, which is convenient for you, since the two on the roof who are fully coherent both describe being incapacitated by, quote, two people, with no clear description of the specific individual responsible for the 43 corridor situation. The cameras on this floor were offline. She looked at him steadily. I'm noting the gap. I'm not filling it in any particular direction. Dylan looked back at her with the same steadiness. I understand. Good. She moved down the corridor toward the conference room, legal pad under her arm. Cal appeared at Dylan's shoulder like he'd been standing there the whole time, which he might have been. She's sharp, he said. Yes. You trust her? Dylan thought about it. I trust that she's good at her job, and her job is the same direction as our interest tonight. Close enough, Cal said. Vivian's formal statement took 2 hours. Dylan knew this because he spent those 2 hours on the 43rd floor being processed through the procedural machinery of the situation. His own statement, a medical assessment from the EMT who'd arrived with the second wave of officers and cleaned and bandaged his hand with the brisk efficiency of someone doing their 9th such job of the night, and a conversation with a second detective whose name he didn't catch that covered the same ground as his conversation with Osei, but from a different angle, like they were triangulating a position. He didn't mind. He understood the process. The process was how you built something that held up afterward, and holding up afterward was the point. At some point during the second hour, Cal left. He didn't make a production of it. He said quietly that he had a thing at 6 a.m. he couldn't miss, clapped Dylan once on the shoulder, and was gone. Dylan didn't ask about the thing at 6 a.m. There were things about Cal's current life he didn't ask about, the same way there were things about Dylan's current life Cal didn't push on. And that mutual restraint was the thing that had kept them capable of showing up for each other without the complication of too much knowing. He'd text Cal tomorrow, or maybe the day after things settled. At 3:14 a.m., Vivian found him in the break room on 43, a small room with a commercial coffee maker and a refrigerator and a table with 4 chairs, the kind of room that served the practical functions of human maintenance in a building where people worked too long. Dylan was sitting in one of the chairs with a cup of coffee he'd made himself from the machine, and his hand on the table in front of him because holding it at his side made it throb more, and he was not thinking about anything in particular, which was unusual enough for him that he noticed it. She sat down across from him. She looked better than she had on the roof, or different anyway. Still tired, still precise, but something in her posture had changed. She was carrying less somehow. Not less than she'd started the night carrying, but less than she'd been carrying 3 hours ago, which was the kind of improvement that happened when the immediate crisis had passed and the body allowed itself to acknowledge that. She had a paper cup of her own, which meant she'd also found the coffee machine. "Detective Osei wants me at the precinct at 7 to execute the formal evidence transfer," she said. "Then the board meeting at 9. How do you feel about that?" She considered the question seriously. "I feel like 9 a.m. is 4.5 hours away, and I've been awake for 21 hours, and I need to get through both of those things before I'm allowed to sleep." She drank her coffee. "And I feel like Marcus Reeves is going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow expecting to announce the end of everything I've built, and I'm going to be sitting at the head of the table. How does that feel?" She looked at him over the rim of the cup. Something moved through her expression, not satisfaction, not anger, something more complicated than either. "It feels like something I'm not going to fully process until it's over. Right now it mostly feels like an obligation." He nodded. He understood obligations. She said, "I've been thinking about something you said in the server room, that trusting someone who then betrays you isn't the same as a mistake in judgment. I said it doesn't make you wrong for trusting." "Right." She turned the cup in her hands. "I've been the CEO of my own company since I was 23 years old. I've made decisions that affected hundreds of employees, billions in market value, patients whose treatments depend on research we fund. And in 7 years, the thing I'm most," she paused, selecting the word carefully, "disrupted by is that I didn't see Marcus Reeves coming. Not because of what he did to the company, because of what it means that I didn't see it." Dylan looked at her. "What does it mean to you? That either I'm not as good at reading people as I thought I was, or I'm good at reading people, but I chose not to read him because it was more comfortable not to." "Could be both," Dylan said. "It could be both," she agreed. "That's actually worse." "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not trying to make me feel better about it." "You didn't ask me to." "Most people would." "I know." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Tell me about the mission, the one you left for." He didn't answer immediately. The coffee maker behind him made a small sound, a thermal cycling click, nothing significant. "You don't have to," she said. I'm not asking to trade. I told you about Reeves, and I'm not using that as currency for something you don't want to talk about." "I know you're not," he said. He put his cup down. "There was an operation, overseas. I can't tell you where or what the objective was. What I can tell you is that it went wrong in a way that wasn't predicted and wasn't anyone's specific failure. It was the kind of wrong that happens when you've planned for every variable except the one that turns out to matter." He stopped. 2 people didn't come back. One of them was 24. He'd been on my team for 8 months. The break room was very quiet. Elena, my wife, she'd been asking me for 2 years to consider transitioning out. She wasn't. He stopped again, and the stop was longer this time. She wasn't wrong to ask. I kept saying I needed more time, another tour, that I was close to a natural transition point. And then she died. And Lily was 18 months old, and I was in a debrief room 3,000 miles away being told about a car accident on Route 9 and thinking that I had used up every argument I had for staying in something instead of going home. He picked up the cup again, looked at it. So I went home. Vivian said nothing. She had the quality, rare, he'd found, of knowing when saying nothing was the right thing. Lily doesn't remember her mother, he said. She was too young. She asks sometimes. She knows what happened in the way that a 5-year-old knows things, the shapes and edges of it without the interior. And I tell her what I can tell her, and I leave the rest for when she's older. He put the cup down. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I don't know if there's a right. There probably isn't a right, Vivian said. There's probably just what you do with what you have. He looked at her. I don't have children, she said. So I'm aware that I'm saying this from outside. But I've built something from nothing under conditions where I didn't know if I was doing it right most of the time, and the honest answer is that you don't always find out until later, sometimes much later. She paused. The fact that you don't know it's actually something. Some people don't have that. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She asked me last week why I work at night instead of the day. What did you tell her? I told her the building needed cleaning when it was empty, and I was good at making things clean. Is that true? The building part, yes. The other part, he made a small gesture that wasn't quite a shrug. I'm adequate. I'm a competent janitor. I'm not remarkable. You're a competent janitor, Vivian said, who also happened to identify a coordinated building entry operation before it fully executed. Neutralize multiple armed contractors, keep me and a critical piece of evidence intact, and coordinate an external response while doing it, in a janitor's uniform, with a wrench and a piece of cord. And a monitor cable, he said, and a monitor cable. Something in her expression was almost a smile. I'm going to be honest with you, Dylan. I have a director of corporate security. His name is Warren. He's been in that role for 3 years. He's a good man with solid credentials and extensive experience. Dylan waited. He was not in this building tonight, Vivian said. He was at home, asleep, because the people who planned this operation made sure his schedule was clear and his attention was elsewhere. I don't fully know yet how they managed that, but I know that when this building needed someone, Warren wasn't here. That's not entirely fair to him, Dylan said. He didn't know. I know it's not fair, she said. I'm not firing Warren. I'm not blaming him. I'm making a different point. She held his gaze directly. I'm telling you that the gap between what my company has in terms of security capability and what it apparently needs is significant. And I'm telling you that I'm aware of one person who demonstrated tonight, concretely and under real conditions, what that gap looks like when it's filled. Dylan looked at the table, at his bandaged hand, at the dull reflection of the break room light in the surface of his mostly empty coffee cup. He said, I have a daughter who needs to be somewhere safe. I know. I'm not in a position to take on something that puts me in harm's way regularly, whatever I used to do. That's not compatible with being the only parent she has. I'm not offering you what you used to do, Vivian said. I'm not asking you to run operations or take personal risk. What I'm describing is oversight, systems, the work that happens before a situation like tonight becomes necessary. The planning and the assessment and the protocols that mean, ideally, that a thing like last night never happens. She paused. You saw the gaps in my building's security before anyone with a weapon came through the door. You identified them from a maintenance cart. That's the capability I'm describing. He didn't say anything. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, she said. Tonight you should go home and see your daughter and sleep. I have a board meeting and a detective and probably 48 hours of the worst kind of paperwork before I can think in a straight line again. She pushed back from the table. I'm just telling you that the conversation exists to be had. When things are less... She looked around the break room at the 43rd floor of the building where the night had happened. When things are less like this. She stood, picked up her cup, looked at him. Lily's lucky, she said, for what it's worth. He looked up. To have someone who went home, she said, simply. And she took her cup and walked out of the break room and back into the corridor where the night was still being sorted and cataloged and turned into the kind of record that courts could use. Dylan sat in the break room for another few minutes. His hand throbbed. His shoulder was stiff. He was exhausted in the way that followed the specific chemistry of sustained high-stakes physical and mental activity, the crash that came after the adrenaline had fully metabolized and left nothing behind but tired muscle and a strange, flat clarity. He thought about what Vivian had said. Not the job offer, or the thing that wasn't yet a job offer, the conversation that existed to be had. He thought about the other thing, the simpler thing. Lily's lucky to have someone who went home. Elena had said something similar once, in the middle of an argument he'd started by being defensive about a deployment timeline, and she'd finished by saying, quietly and without anger, that she just wanted him to make it back. Not because she couldn't handle the single parenting, or the long silences, or the deployments that ran over schedule, but because Lily was going to need him there, physically present, in the ordinary, unglamorous, continuous way that meant something different from heroism. She'd been right. She'd been right, and she hadn't lived to see him prove it. And he had to live with that particular mathematics every single day, which he did, because there was no other option, and because Lily was worth every difficulty of the calculation. He got up, threw away the cup, looked at the coffee maker, which was still doing its small thermal cycles in the corner. He went back out into the corridor, found Officer Ramirez, and asked if there was anything else they needed from him tonight, or if he could go. Ramirez checked with someone on his radio, came back. Detective Osi says she'll need you at the precinct tomorrow afternoon for a follow-up, 2 p.m. if that works. It works, Dylan said. You're free to go. He went to the elevator bank, the regular elevators, which had been restored to normal operation sometime in the last hour, and pressed the button and waited, and the door opened, and he rode down 43 floors in the particular silence of a building that had been through something and was beginning the long process of settling back into itself. The lobby was still active. Officers, evidence techs, a person with a camera from some department Dylan didn't know. He signed out through a checkpoint that had been established near the main entrance, gave his contact information again, and walked out through the glass doors into the street. The city at 4:15 a.m. had its own specific quality. Not quiet. New York was never fully quiet, but reduced. The way a sound becomes more itself when you strip away everything that was layering over it. The garbage trucks were running on the east side of the block. A taxi moved through the intersection at the far end. The air was cool and it smelled like asphalt and the river, and the particular night smell of a city that never stopped producing itself. Dylan stood on the sidewalk and breathed it. His phone was in his pocket. He pulled it out. No missed calls from Mrs. Adiemi, which meant Lily had slept through without issue. He sent a text. Finishing up work. On my way home. Thank you. He put the phone away and started walking toward the subway. He didn't take the subway often at this hour. Usually he drove to his night shifts, an arrangement that cost more in parking than it saved in convenience, but that meant he could leave on his own schedule and get home before Lily woke. Tonight he'd taken the subway because he'd been running late and hadn't wanted to deal with parking, and that had turned out to be the kind of small decision that illustrated how much any given night could diverge from what you expected of it. He walked 3 blocks to the station and went down the stairs and waited on the platform with a man in food service whites reading something on his phone, and a woman in scrubs who was asleep upright against a support pillar, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to sleep in any available window. The train came. He sat, and he didn't look at his phone, and he didn't think about the 43rd floor or the roof or the server room or the electrical corridor with its smell of warm components and dust. He thought about breakfast. Lily was going through a phase where she only wanted scrambled eggs, which he was happy to make because scrambled eggs were something he could do reliably and she would eat without negotiation. And negotiating with a 5-year-old about food at 6:30 in the morning before he'd slept was a category of difficulty he tried to avoid when he could. He thought about whether they had eggs. He thought they had eggs. The train moved through the tunnel. At his stop, he came back up into the street and walked the 4 blocks to his building, which was a 6-story walk-up in a neighborhood that had been trying to gentrify for 15 years without fully committing to it. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Adiemi was in 3B, 2 doors down, and her light was on under the door when he passed, which meant she'd stayed up. He knocked softly. She opened it almost immediately. She was a tall woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a book in her hand, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him when he came home from nights. A quick, complete assessment that started at his face and ended at his hands and arrived at a conclusion she usually didn't articulate. Tonight she looked at his bandaged hand and articulated it. "Dylan? It's fine," he said. "She okay?" "She's fine. Asleep since 9. She wanted to know if you'd be home for breakfast." I'll be here for breakfast. Mrs. Adiemi looked at him for another moment. At his hand, at his face, at whatever she saw there that she'd accumulated the experience to read correctly. She said, "You need to eat something." "I will. I have rice from dinner. It'll take you 2 minutes in the microwave." He was about to say no, and then he realized he was hungry enough that no was stupid. "Thank you." He ate the rice standing at his kitchen counter, which took 6 minutes because he was hungrier than 2 minutes of microwave rice was going to fix. And then he checked on Lily. Her door was open the way she liked it. The nightlight was on, a small plastic star that projected constellations on the ceiling, a gift from his sister that Lily had decided was the most important object she owned. Dylan stood in the doorway and looked at her in the dim starlight. She was on her side with her arm hanging off the mattress, reaching for something in her sleep the way she always did. Her hair was across her face. Pancake the goldfish moved in slow circles in his tank on the dresser. He stood there for a while, not thinking about anything complicated, not processing the night or calculating what came next or turning over Vivian's words or the weight of Ose's legal pad or any of the dozen things he would have to deal with starting in 10 hours. Just standing in the doorway of his daughter's room and watching her breathe and being, simply, the person who had come home. He went to his own room, sat on the edge of the bed. His hand throbbed once, clearly, and then settled into a dull background ache. He'd need to change the bandage in the morning. He'd need to explain the bandage to Lily, who would immediately want to know everything about it and would not accept a vague answer. He'd tell her he'd been clumsy at work. She'd give him the same look Mrs. Adiemi had given him, the look that said she knew the number was probably larger than what she was being told. And then she'd make him promise to be more careful, and he'd promise, and she'd accept the promise with the pragmatic trust of a child who had decided that her father was basically reliable, even if he was sometimes mysterious. He lay back on the bed without taking off his shoes, which he would normally never do, and looked at the ceiling. He thought about what it meant to be done with something and still be yourself. He didn't have a clean answer for that either. He was starting to think that the clean answers he'd been waiting for since he came home, the moment of clarity that would tell him who he was now, what he was building, whether the version of Dylan Mercer, who cleaned floors 5 nights a week and read Rabbit audiobooks and made scrambled eggs, was the real one, or just the one he was performing. He was starting to think those answers didn't come in moments. They accumulated. Slowly, in the background, while you were doing other things. While you were making breakfast. While you were reading to someone who was too small to read yet. While you were standing in a dark corridor, reading emergency markings on a door and deciding, without really deciding, what you were going to do about it. He closed his eyes. Outside, the city continued doing what cities did. And in the apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood that was always in the process of becoming something, the man who had once been one of the best operators anyone who knew him would name fell asleep before he'd finished the thought and slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in a very long time. He woke up to the smell of something burning, not dangerous burning, not the sharp chemical smell of something electrical or structural. The specific domestic burning of bread left too long in a toaster, which Dylan had experienced enough times to identify it before he was fully conscious, and which told him 2 things simultaneously, that it was morning and that Lily was awake. He sat up. His hand announced itself immediately. The bandage had tightened overnight, and the palm underneath it had the swollen, hot feeling of tissue that had done more than it was designed for. He flexed his fingers carefully, confirmed that everything worked, and stood up. He was still in yesterday's clothes, minus the shoes, which he'd apparently managed to remove at some point in the night without remembering it. His janitor's uniform smelled like the 43rd floor and the electrical corridor and the specific chemistry of a night that had been a lot of things. He changed. In the kitchen, Lily was standing on the step stool she used to reach the counter, examining a piece of toast with the focused displeasure of someone confronting a significant problem. The toast was dark on one side. The toaster was producing a thin thread of smoke. "The toast did it wrong," she said, without looking up. "Did you set it too high?" Dylan asked. "I set it the same as always." "The same as always might be too high." She looked at him over her shoulder, taking in the bandage on his hand with the immediate, complete attention that 5-year-olds applied to anything out of the ordinary. Her eyes tracked from the bandage to his face and back. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. "I hurt it at work." "How?" "I wasn't careful enough." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd been developing for about a year now, the one that suggested she found his explanations incomplete but had decided to accept them provisionally. It was, he sometimes thought, the most Elena thing about her, that willingness to let something go without fully letting it go. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "A little." "You should be more careful." "You're right," he said. "I should." She turned back to the toast. "I was going to make breakfast." "I see that. I thought you'd be tired." He looked at the back of her head, the sleep-tangled hair, the slight hunch of her shoulders as she studied the toast problem, and felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a word for and didn't need one. "I am tired," he said, "but I'm also here. So let me do the eggs and you eat the toast." "It's burnt." "Scrape it over the sink. It'll be fine." She considered this. "That works?" "That works." She carried the toast to the sink and scraped it with a knife and inspected the result with the seriousness of a quality control inspection. And Dylan made the eggs, scrambled with a little too much butter the way she liked them, because some mornings the right thing was too much butter and not apologizing for it. And they sat at the small kitchen table and ate, and outside the window the morning was doing what mornings in the city did, moving through its stages of sound and light with the indifference of something that had no stake in what had happened the night before. Lily ate most of her eggs and all of the toast, declared the toast scraping method actually good, and asked 3 questions about clouds before the meal was over. Dylan answered all 3. The third answer he was less sure about, so he said he wasn't sure, and she said they could look it up later, and he said yes, they could do that. After breakfast, she went to watch her cartoon, and he sat at the table with a second cup of coffee and his phone. There were 7 messages, 2 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be Detective Osei's direct line. She'd texted the 2 p.m. confirmation and added that she'd spoken with the prosecutor's office about witness protection protocols, and he should bring identification and any documentation he was comfortable providing. One from Cal, which said only, "Heard it went okay." Good. 3 from his building supervisor, Gerald, who managed the maintenance contracts and who had apparently received some kind of notification from Sterling Towers Facilities Management overnight that was causing him significant professional anxiety. And 1 from a number he didn't recognize at all, with a 212 area code. He opened that one last. "This is Vivian Sterling. I got your number from the emergency contact form you filed with building management 14 months ago. The board meeting is at 9. It's 7:42. I wanted you to know that I'm going in." A pause. He could tell from the timestamps that a second message had followed about 3 minutes later. "Also, thank you. I meant it last night, and I mean it now. That's all." He read it twice. Then he put the phone face down on the table and finished his coffee. At 7:58 a.m., 43 blocks north of Dylan's kitchen table, Marcus Reeves walked into the Sterling Industries boardroom. He was composed. That was the thing about Reeves. He had spent 30 years in corporate finance developing the specific kind of composure that was less about actual calm and more about the performance of it, the disciplined external stillness that made other people assume the interior matched. He was good at it. He'd used it to close deals, survive audits, navigate 3 corporate collapses that had ended other people's careers and left his intact. He was using it now, walking through the boardroom door at 3 minutes to 9 with his briefcase and his coffee and the quiet certainty of a man who believed he had already won. He hadn't heard from the contractors. That concerned him. He wasn't going to let it show, but it concerned him because the protocol was a check-in by 4 a.m. and the check-in hadn't come. He'd spent the hours between 4 and 7 running scenarios, and the one he'd settled on, the one that most comfortably accommodated the silence, was that the operation had gone cleanly, but the check-in had been skipped for operational security reasons, that Vivian Sterling had signed or been removed, or both, and that what remained was the formality of this morning. The formality of 7 board members voting on an emergency restructuring proposal that he had personally drafted, personally lobbied, and personally positioned over the last 8 months. He set his briefcase down at his usual seat, to the right of the head chair, which was where he always sat, close enough to the center of power to matter and far enough to maintain the posture of deference that the role of CFO required. He looked at the head chair. It was empty. Good, he thought. Of course it was empty. That was the point. He opened his briefcase and removed the restructuring proposal. Printed, because this meeting needed to feel official, needed the weight of paper, and set it in front of him and looked at the view. Sterling Tower's boardroom had the same panoramic view as the executive conference room below it, the whole glittering spread of the city at morning, and Reeves had always privately felt that the view was something the company would keep even after Vivian Sterling's name was off the door. The other board members filed in over the next 2 minutes. He greeted them with the measured warmth he'd calibrated over years, present enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to maintain authority. 2 of them were his. 3 were neutral. 2 were Vivian's, which had always been the math he'd worked against. At 9:01, the head chair was still empty. At 9:02, the door opened. Reeves looked up with the expression already arranged for the absence he expected. The composed, regretful look of a man prepared to proceed without the CEO, who had apparently failed to appear. Vivian Sterling walked in. She was wearing a dark jacket and her hair was not perfect, and there were shadows under her eyes that no amount of the morning had fully erased, and she walked to the head of the table and sat down and set a closed laptop on the table in front of her and looked at Marcus Reeves. She didn't say anything for a moment. Reeves felt something shift in his chest that was not composure. It was the specific physical sensation of a scenario failing, the interior version of a load-bearing calculation giving way. "Vivian," he said, "I wasn't sure you'd—" "I know," she said. 2 more people came through the door behind her. One was a woman in a dark coat who sat against the wall with a legal pad. Not a board member, an observer, and Reeves clocked her with a lawyer's habit of assessing everyone in a room. The other was a man Reeves didn't recognize, also sitting against the wall, who had the particular quality of stillness that Reeves had encountered before in people whose professional histories were not fully visible on a resume. He looked at them, looked at Vivian. "We have observers today," Vivian said. "Detective Karen Osai from the NYPD Financial Crimes Division, who is here as a courtesy witness to the proceedings, and Mr. James Whitfield from the Federal Prosecutor's Office." She paused. "Before we begin, I have some materials I'd like to enter into the board record." She opened the laptop, turned it to face the center of the table. What appeared on the screen was the document Reeves had spent 8 months constructing, the patent transfer agreement, the Cayman Shell Company registration, the secondary authorization pathway he'd built into the approval system. His own signature, his own emails, the ones he'd been careful about but apparently not careful enough, and the communication logs between himself and the private equity consortium that he'd believed were buried behind enough layers of misdirection to survive any internal audit. They were not buried. Reeves looked at the screen. He looked at Vivian. Her face was the same as it had always been. Direct, controlled. The face of someone who processed more than they showed. But there was something in it now that hadn't been there in the 7 years he'd worked for her. Not anger, not triumph. Something quieter and more absolute. She had always trusted him, and she had stopped. "Marcus," she said, "I think you know what this is." He could have said many things. He was a man who always had things to say. He had 30 years of practiced language for difficult situations, entire vocabularies built for the specific purpose of managing rooms when things went wrong. He said nothing. "The board will review the materials," Vivian said, to the room rather than to him, her voice carrying the specific authority of someone who had built the room they were sitting in and knew it in ways that no one else at the table did. "Detective Osai will explain the legal status of the evidence and the ongoing investigation. After that, we'll proceed with a vote on the restructuring proposal. Mr. Reeves's restructuring proposal." She looked at him one more time. "And then we'll discuss what the company does next." Reeves's lawyer arrived 22 minutes later, which was 4 minutes after 2 additional officers appeared in the boardroom doorway, and Reeves had understood, fully and finally, the specific shape of what he'd built and what it had cost him. Dylan was at the 2 p.m. meeting with Detective Osei. He'd spent the morning the way he'd told himself he would, present, unhurried, available for whatever Lily needed, which turned out to be a trip to the park 2 blocks away, where she ran in circles for 40 minutes with the focused energy of someone burning through something interior, and a stop at the drugstore on the way home, where he bought bandage supplies, and she spent 8 minutes choosing between 2 flavors of gum with the seriousness of a major life decision. He changed the bandage at home. The palm looked worse than it felt, which was a reversal from the night before, and he decided this was probably a good sign. He took 2 ibuprofen, which he'd resisted taking the night before out of some stubbornness he couldn't fully account for even now, and they helped. Mrs. Adeyemi came at 1:30 to sit with Lily. Dylan put on a clean shirt and a jacket that wasn't his work jacket, and he took the subway to the precinct on West 54th, and he sat across a table from Detective Osei in a room that smelled like bad coffee and air conditioning, and he told her everything he could tell her within the lines of what he was authorized to discuss. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Osei asked good questions. She didn't ask the ones she already knew the answers to, which was a sign of genuine preparation, and she didn't push on the compartmentalized material when he indicated the lines, which was a sign of someone who understood that not every answer belonged in every room. She had already spoken with Commander Voss, who had provided, through the appropriate channels, a document that Osei referred to once without elaborating on and set in a folder without reading aloud. When they were done, she walked him to the door of the precinct. Reeves was arrested at 9:47 a.m., she said. He's been cooperative in the sense that he's said nothing without his attorney present, which is his right and also what any sensible person would do. She looked at the street. 3 of the contractors on the roof have been charged. The other 2 are cooperating in exchange for consideration. The 6th man, the one who wasn't in the building directly but coordinated the external communication, we have a name. It'll move. How long? Dylan asked. The financial case is complex. It always is. Months, probably, before a trial? Possibly longer. She looked at him. Your testimony will be important, but not central. The documentary evidence Ms. Sterling preserved is the core. You're corroborating witness to the events of last night, which is significant, but not the thing that wins or loses it. He nodded. And my daughter. I spoke with the prosecutor's office this morning. Your participation in the case will be characterized in a way that minimizes your personal exposure. The elements of your background that are classified will not appear in public filings. She paused. I can't make guarantees on behalf of defense attorneys who will try to introduce what they can, but the prosecutor's office will push back on that, and Commander Voss's office has indicated they will also push back. She looked at him directly. You have more people in your corner than you might think. He thought about Cal driving in from Queens, about Voss picking up on the 6th ring at whatever hour it had been and saying she'd make the call, about Osei herself, who had arrived fast and worked harder than she'd needed to, and had noted the gap in the 43 corridor without filling it in any particular direction. I know, he said. Good. She extended her hand. He shook it. 2 p.m. next Thursday for a follow-up. I'll text you. He went back down the precinct steps into the afternoon. The city was doing its afternoon thing. The particular density of Midtown at 3 p.m., the specific sound of a place that never fully stopped for anything. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it, and then he took out his phone. He looked at Vivian's message from that morning. Read it again. Then he typed, How did it go? 3 minutes passed. Then, Reeves is under arrest. The restructuring proposal was voted down 7-0. The evidence is in formal record. A pause, then, It went. Another pause, then, How's your hand? He typed, Better. Changed the bandage. 2 p.m. meeting done. Then, after a moment, Lily scraped the burnt toast and declared the method valid. The response took a little longer this time. When it came, it was brief. That's the best thing I've heard today. And then, when you're ready to have the other conversation, the one I mentioned in the break room, I'm available. No urgency. Just when you're ready. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the message. The conversation that existed to be had, the job that wasn't the job he used to do, the role she'd described as oversight in systems and the work that happened before things became emergencies, the planning and the assessment and the architecture of prevention rather than response. He thought about what Cal had said in the corridor. You've always been still you. He thought about what Ose had said about the gap in his available testimony. He thought about Voss on the phone at whatever hour it had been, saying, "You should have stayed out of it, Dylan." And then, "I'll make the call." The thing about the people who'd known him in that other life was that none of them had ever fully believed he was out. Not because they doubted his intentions, but because they understood the math in a way that went beyond intentions. Some people had a capability that didn't go away because you stopped using it. It just waited. And the question was never really whether the capability existed, but what you chose to do with it and under what terms and for whose benefit. He'd spent 14 months telling himself the terms were simple: minimum exposure, maximum presence for Lily, nothing that put him in a position where she could lose another parent. Those terms were still true. They'd always be true. But Vivian had said something that he kept coming back to, that she wasn't offering him what he used to do. That what she was describing was the work that meant, ideally, that a night like last night never had to happen. He thought about the propped emergency exit door, the redirected camera, the notation marks on the doorframe. He'd seen all of it before anyone else in the building had known anything was wrong. Not because he was exceptional, well, maybe because of that, but not only because of that, because he understood how these things worked from the inside, because he could read the marks that other people walked past. That was a specific thing, a real thing, and using it to build walls rather than breach them, to protect a place rather than operate against one. That was a different calculation than the one he'd been making. He typed back, "I know. I'll be in touch." He put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the subway. 2 weeks after the night at Sterling Tower on a Tuesday morning that was unremarkable in every other respect, Dylan Mercer arrived at the offices of Sterling Industries. Not the tower, a different building, the company's secondary administrative offices on the east side, and met with Vivian Sterling for 45 minutes. It was not a glamorous meeting. It was, in fact, deliberately ordinary. He sat across from her at a conference table that was significantly smaller and less imposing than the 43-floor boardroom, and she had a legal pad and he had a notepad he'd bought at the drugstore, and they talked about what the role would actually look like in practice. She didn't oversell it. He'd half expected that she would, that the version of the conversation he had in person would have more polish than the break room version, more professional gloss, more of the pitch quality that CEOs deployed when they wanted something. Instead, she was direct in the same way she'd been direct in the server room. "Here's the problem. Here is what I think you can contribute to solving it. Here are the parts I don't know and you'd need to figure out." The parts she didn't know were significant. Her security infrastructure had obvious gaps that predated Reeves. She'd been too trusting of a system she hadn't personally designed, too willing to delegate the oversight of it to people whose interests she hadn't fully verified. Rebuilding it meant starting from a realistic assessment of what existed and what didn't, which was the kind of work that required someone who didn't have a stake in telling her the current state was better than it was. "Warren," Dylan said. Warren was the existing director of corporate security, the man who hadn't been in the building the night of the attack. "Warren has been with us 3 years, Vivian said. He's competent at the day-to-day management. What he lacks is she chose carefully, the adversarial imagination. The ability to think like the people who want to get in rather than the people who are trying to keep them out." "You want me above him or alongside him?" "Alongside, initially. He reports to me directly. I'm suggesting a new position. Director of Security Architecture. Different scope. It's about building the systems, not running them daily." "That's a title." "It's also a description," she said. "You'd have authority over security infrastructure decisions, approval rights on new protocols, access to everything in the building's systems." She paused. "And the right to tell me directly when something is wrong, even if I don't want to hear it." He looked at her. "That last one is the most important one," she said. "Yes." She set down her pen. "Marcus Reeves sat 2 feet from me for 7 years and built something I didn't see. Part of that was his deception. Part of it was that I surrounded myself with people who found it easier to agree with me than to push back." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the tone of someone who had done the honest accounting. "I'm not interested in doing that again." Dylan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the last time he'd been in a professional situation where he was expected to tell a superior something they didn't want to hear, about how that had gone and what it had cost, and whether the cost had been worth it. "I'm not easy to manage," he said, "for what it's worth." "I know," she said. "I'm not easy to work for." A pause. "We might have a difficult working relationship." "Probably, but a functional one." He thought about it. "Probably that, too." She extended her hand across the table. He looked at it, looked at her face, direct, composed, the specific quality of someone who meant what they said and had stopped pretending otherwise after a night that had made pretending feel irrelevant. He shook her hand. The paperwork took another week. The title was real. It appeared on a document that a company lawyer brought to the same conference room on a Friday afternoon, and Dylan read every line of it the way he read everything, carefully and without rushing, and asked 2 questions that the lawyer answered satisfactorily and signed it. He kept the maintenance job for another 2 weeks, finishing out his contract with Gerald's company in a way that left things clean. Gerald, who had never quite understood what he'd had, threw a small goodbye that consisted of a grocery store cake in the break room and a handshake and a comment that Dylan was the most reliable night contractor he'd ever placed, which was genuinely meant and which Dylan received genuinely. He started at Sterling Industries on a Monday in October, which was an ordinary day with ordinary weather and no particular significance except that it was the day he walked into a building with his name on an office door and sat down at a desk with a view of the city and a blank legal pad and began the methodical, unglamorous, deeply human work of making something safer than it had been. It was not dramatic. It was, in many ways, the opposite of dramatic. It was the work of lists and assessments and honest conversations and the careful mapping of gaps between what a place thought it was and what it actually was. It was the work of looking at camera positions and asking the uncomfortable question about who had access to the override codes and whether the background verification process for security contractors was actually as rigorous as it appeared on paper. It was also, in the way that mattered, the work he was built for. Not because he enjoyed it more than other things, or because it was his calling in any simple sense, but because he could do it and it needed doing, and the terms he'd negotiated with himself were ones he could live with. Daytime hours, mostly. Benefits. A salary that meant Lily could go to the school he'd been trying to figure out how to afford. Home by 6 on most nights. Not every night. That was a thing he'd been honest with himself about. This was not a 9-to-5 existence, and there would be nights where something needed his attention at a time that wasn't convenient, and he'd negotiated that in his own interior before he'd signed anything. But mostly home by 6. Lily adapted to the schedule change with the flexibility of a child who had her entire remembered life reorganized around whatever the current version of normal was. She asked once, seriously, if he still cleaned buildings. He said no, he worked in one now instead. She thought about this and said that seemed more comfortable, which it was, and she asked if the building had a good bathroom, which he confirmed it did. And that was more or less the extent of the transition discussion. Mrs. Adeyemi threw a small celebration of her own, which consisted of giving him a plant for his new office that he had no idea how to keep alive, and which Lily named Gerald after his old supervisor, for reasons that remained unclear. He put Gerald the plant on the windowsill and decided to learn how to keep it alive. The criminal case moved the way Osei had said it would, slowly, thoroughly, with the grinding inevitability of a process that was unglamorous but real. Dylan testified in a preliminary hearing in December, which was straightforward and lasted 2 hours, and resulted in Marcus Reeves's attorney making a motion that was denied. Commander Voss appeared in chambers for the portion of the testimony that touched on Dylan's background, which was handled in a way that kept his history out of the public record without excising its relevance from the legal one. On the day of Reeves's plea, he ultimately took a deal, 11 years, financial restitution, which Osei texted Dylan about in 2 sentences without editorial. Dylan was in a meeting with Warren and 2 outside contractors who were rebidding the building's security systems contract. He read the text, put his phone away, and went back to the meeting. Warren had become, over the months, something more complicated than Dylan had expected. He'd anticipated friction. A man whose authority was being reshaped by someone new would have reason for friction, and Warren wasn't the kind of person who disguised his feelings well. The friction had been real, early. A meeting in November where Warren had said directly that he thought his methods were being second-guessed without sufficient basis. And Dylan had said, equally directly, that some of them were, and that the basis was documented, and he was welcome to review the documentation. Warren had reviewed it, had been quiet for 3 days, and then had come back and said also directly that 2 of the points were legitimate and 1 was overreach, and he wanted to discuss the overreach. They discussed it. Dylan had revised his position on 1 subpoint. Warren had revised his system on 2 others. It was not a friendship. It was a functional professional relationship between 2 people who respected each other's competence and found each other difficult, which was most of the important relationships Dylan had ever had. 6 months after Dylan started, Vivian called him into her office on a Thursday afternoon. Not the conference room, her actual office, the corner office on the 44th floor where all of this had started, with the photo of herself and her sister on the desk, and the view of the city that looked like someone had spread all the money in the world across a dark table and lit it from below. He sat down across from her. She had a document in front of her that she pushed across the desk without preamble. He picked it up and read it. It was a 6-month security assessment. His own work, the report he'd submitted the previous week summarizing the architectural changes made and the gaps that remained. She'd annotated it in the margins. 12 annotations, which he read in order. 10 of them were questions. Good questions. Specific. The kind that pointed at the parts of his assessment that he'd been least certain of and had glossed slightly in the final draft. One was a comment. This section underestimates the insider risk from the IT department. See attached analysis. One was a check mark next to the section on physical security infrastructure with the word, finally. He set the document down. The IT section, he said. It's a gap, she said. I know because I went looking after I read your draft, and what I found is not reassuring. I'll address it. I know you will. She looked at him. I'm not giving you the document as a critique. I'm giving it to you because you built something worth annotating. He looked at the document. 12 annotations, 6 months of work, reduced and refined and questioned in the specific way that only happened when someone had read a thing seriously. The IT section is a genuine gap, he said. I knew it when I submitted. I flagged it as ongoing. You flagged it vaguely, she said. That's not a habit I'm going to let you develop. He looked at her. Something that might, on another face, have been the beginning of a smile was present but contained on his. You're going to be difficult to work for. I told you, she said. You did. She picked up her own copy of the report. The board presentation is in 2 weeks. They want a full security architecture review for the annual governance meeting. You'll present it. Warren usually presents to the board. Warren usually presents the operational review. This is different. This is architecture. She looked at him. You built it. You present it. He thought about being in a room full of board members, about the specific performance quality that kind of room required, the language and the posture, and the management of what you revealed versus what you held back. It wasn't a thing he'd done much of in the second half of his professional life. He'd done it in the first half, in different rooms for different purposes, but the skill existed. Okay, he said. Good. She made a note on her pad. Then she looked up and said, without transitioning, the way she said most things, How is Lily? She's good, he said. She decided she wants to be a marine biologist. What changed her mind from, what was the previous one? Astronaut. She decided space was too far from the ocean. Vivian nodded seriously. That's reasonable. I thought so. Does she know what a marine biologist does? She knows they study fish. She considers Pancake relevant professional experience. Vivian looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize over 6 months, the one where something that wanted to be a laugh was being managed into something more contained. She mostly won that management. Not always. Pancake is still alive, she said. Pancake is thriving. He got a bigger tank in September. Good, she said. And then, because she was Vivian Sterling and she meant things directly. Good for both of them. He stood up, picked up the annotated report, looked at it one more time. The IT section, he said. I'll have a revised assessment to you by end of week. End of week is fine. He walked to the door, stopped. There was something he'd been thinking about for a while. Not in a way that required action, not in a way that had been urgent, but present, in the background, the way the important things tended to stay until they had room to be said. He turned around. "The night in the server room," he said. "You asked me how I could tell when the frequency was, when something was wrong. You didn't use those words. But that was the question." She looked at him. She remembered. She was the kind of person who remembered everything. "I said I couldn't explain it in a way that would make immediate sense," he said. "That was true then, but the honest answer is that it's not instinct exactly. It's accumulated pattern. You look at enough things long enough with enough at stake, and you start to see the space between what's supposed to be there and what's actually there." He paused. The camera, the marked door, the smell of solvent, none of them were the thing by themselves. Together they were the shape of something wrong. She was listening. "I think that's what you hired," he said. "Someone who learned to see the space between what's supposed to be there and what's actually there. In a building, in a system, in a room full of people." He paused again. "I don't say that to talk myself up. I say it because it's useful for you to know what it actually is, so you can use it right." She held his gaze for a moment. "Noted," she said, simply. The way she received useful information, without performance, without excess. He left. In the elevator going down, he thought about the distance between where he'd been 14 months ago and where he was now. Not the external distance. That was just an address change and a job title. The interior distance. The space between the version of himself who had pushed a mop cart through the 43rd floor and told himself that invisibility was a choice he'd made rather than a condition he'd settled into, and the version of himself who had a plant named Gerald on a windowsill and a daughter who wanted to study fish and a job that asked him to be exactly who he actually was. The distance wasn't as large as he'd expected. That was the thing. He'd thought for a long time that the man he'd been and the man he was trying to be were in fundamental conflict, that being present for Lily meant dismantling the other self piece by piece until what remained was someone unrecognizable to the people who'd known him in that other life. But Cal had been right in the corridor when he'd said, "You've always been still you." The mop cart hadn't changed it. The janitor's uniform hadn't changed it. The 14 months of trying to be someone simpler hadn't changed who he was underneath. It had just given him time to understand what he actually wanted to do with it, which was a different question from what he was capable of, and a more honest one. The elevator opened at the lobby. He walked out through the glass doors into the afternoon. His phone showed 3:17 p.m. He had a meeting at 4 and a call with OC's office at 4:30, and he needed to stop at the drugstore on the way home because they were out of the cereal Lily liked, and she'd been specifically concerned about this at breakfast. He walked down the street and the city moved around him the way it always did, without interest in any individual moving through it, which was fine, which was, in fact, exactly right. The city wasn't supposed to care about any one person. That was what the people in it were for. To care about each other in the particular, imperfect, daily way that didn't look like anything important from the outside, and was, from the inside, the only thing that actually mattered. He stopped at the crosswalk. Across the street, a man was trying to manage a stroller and a bag of groceries and a phone call simultaneously, and he was losing the stroller portion of this equation. And Dylan watched him recover it with the specific, graceless triumph of a person managing more than their hands were designed for, and felt something in his chest that was just ordinary recognition. He was tired. His hand had healed, but his shoulder still occasionally reminded him of the roof and the cable conduit and the half-step of bad balance he'd never fully accounted for. He was going to be in a meeting in 43 minutes, and he was out of his daughter's cereal, and there was a plant on his windowsill named Gerald that he was probably going to forget to water this week. He crossed the street, not because everything was resolved or finished or cleanly wrapped, because nothing ever was, but because there was a cereal aisle at the end of the block and a school pickup at 5:15 and a small person who was going to want to tell him something important about fish the moment he walked through the door. And Dylan Mercer, the former SEAL, the night janitor, the man who had learned to see the space between what was supposed to be there and what actually was, crossed the street in the ordinary afternoon and went to buy the cereal and go home. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.